You're listening to Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Welcome to the divided states of America. In the left corner, you have flaming, unapologetic, admittedly combative lefty Jamal Thomas.
In the right corner, you have independent investigative analyst Shane Stranahan.
This is Fault Lines. Shane, how you doing this morning?
I'm doing fantastic. How are you doing this morning, Jamal?
I'm doing all right. Early, trying to get used to the morning segments, but I'm but making it so far. We're everything is on all cylinders. So let's get into some headlines this morning. We have, let's start here. In the news, Brad Parcells said protesters blocked metal detectors and scared attendees away. AOC said it's due to Zoomers on TikTok signing up to artificially boost the expected attendees count. Parcells said they weeded out phony requests. Republican strategist Steve Smith said his daughter and his friends have hundreds of tickets, so I don't think they actually managed to weed out those requests. Attorney General Jeffrey Berman resigns. Barr said he was asked to resign. Jeffrey said he wasn't asked to resign. Then actually resigned after Trump wrote a letter, although Trump said he wasn't involved. Interesting. Ghislaine Maxwell apparently is living in Paris' apartment. Go figure. How is that woman not behind bars? Also, we have a new START, basically a START treaty. Trump and Putin are holding a meeting later today in Vienna over the new START, due to expire this coming February. Putin has said that he wants to reinstate the treaty. Trump is calling for Xi Jinping and China to join. That is a ridiculous request, considering China doesn't necessarily have that many nuclear weapons in comparison to the United States and Russia. Nevertheless, there we are. Charlotte attacks. So late last night, 2 teens were killed and 12 were injured in Charlotte at a midnight block party. Now, dozens of cop cars and multiple ambulances responded, and apparently cars were ramming people in addition to shots being fired. Wow. Those are your headlines. Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. I thought there was a bang bang. So Shane, I'd like to start off with what should be an outrage covered by every mainstream media outlet. This society has a sickness. I don't mean COVID-19. I'm talking about an abandonment of the social contract. Now, this abandonment of the social contract has taken exponential and appalling form, with nursing homes across the United States taking the rational and despicable action of tossing out sick and poor patients onto the streets for more lucrative COVID-19 patients. Now, we view nursing homes as elderly homes, but in reality, their business model accepts people of all ages who are receiving or recovering from surgery or acute illnesses. As it is a business, there was always a natural incentive to evict patients that accepted Medicaid in favor of patients accepting private insurance, as the latter was more profitable. Again, a rational act under capitalism. The later has kicked into overdrive, or this is kicked into overdrive. Medicare and Medicaid changed their reimbursement formula, making it more profitable for nursing homes to accept sicker patients for a shorter time period. Now, according to nursing home executives and officials, COVID-19 has created a new class of patients that can bring in $600 more a day in Medicare dollars than people with moderate illnesses. Chasing the bugle horn of cash, nursing homes heard the call and, under the rigid, clarifying demand of market forces, dumped the old, the disabled, the mentally degraded into homeless shelters, dilapidated motels, and other unsafe hellholes. The New York Times is reporting that this information is coming from 22 watchdogs in 16 states, in addition to dozens of other elder care lawyers, social workers, and former nursing home executives. Be aware, in some cases, the family wasn't even notified. As in the case of C. Kendrick, an 88-year-old with dementia that was found by police crumpled in a Koreatown sidewalk after the nursing home, Lakeview Terrace, deposited him in an unregulated boarding house without notifying his family. This is outrageous, entirely unacceptable. How can we allow this as a society? And here we are, allowing this as a society. It is bad enough that this country has stood by impotent and incompetent as 42% of the 120,000 deaths. That number is outstanding and outrageous. From COVID-19 occurred in just 0.6% of the population. Let me repeat that. More than 51,000 residents and employees of nursing homes and long-term care facilities have died out of the 120,000 people that have died in this country of COVID-19. Yes, 42% of the deaths and 0.6% of the population. To make matters worse, governments have pushed to shield nursing homes from legal action, with Governor Andrew Cuomo taking extra steps to disallow testing of patients that are being shuffled and what amount to death traps, considering that in March, 6,000 patients had died, roughly 0.6% of New York nursing home population. This was not a foregone conclusion, by the way. Germany had based its actions, oddly enough, on research by U.S. scientists, the very people the U.S. government fought every step of the way regarding policy. The Washington Post reports, despite its older population, Germany has confirmed fewer than 9,000 coronavirus-linked deaths, compared with almost 120,000 in the United States. Germany has about a fourth of the U.S. population. We have failed our elders. In a world without a point, we toil and we gesticulate, dedicating our energies to some task where the overwhelming share of the resources gets sucked to 1%. For example, 95% of the income gains under Hope and Change Obama went to the top 1%. And by the way, Trump will do better than that. And he can only best that by 5%. Hope and change. But despite the inequities, there was always some belief that your society wouldn't throw you away when the productive energies wear thin. Clearly, that belief was wrong. What in the world is this? Do we accept this as acceptable? Yay or nay? Right now, the answer is yay. You realize that states have also fought to shield these insurance companies with all of these deaths from liability. Again, this is outrageous. You want to know why hundreds of thousands of people are still in the streets? They're out there now, so they don't be out there later when they're in their 80s, wandering in the cold. We can do better than this as a society, and frankly, we can do better than this as a world. Shane, this is utterly deplorable. Honestly, it really is. And for all of these people who are talking about go vote, honestly, there is nobody to vote for to change this. Cuomo, Democrat, was the one in New York that was pushing these people into nursing homes, forbidding them to check on whether or not those people had COVID-19, and then on top of that, putting in a provision to basically shield the nursing homes from liability. Who do you vote for, Shane? How do you vote your way out of this?
I don't think you can. That's the problem, and that's why people are so frustrated and they're out in the streets. At least not this election cycle. I think these things take time. I mean, like you're saying, this situation is so deplorable, and I'm glad you focused on this. And within the wider COVID crisis, it's notable, and it in its own like weird, tragic way, it makes sense, because after all, it was the elderly, it was the immunocompromised, but specifically it was the elderly who were going to get shafted anyway. It's like all of the people who are skeptical about the lockdowns. Again, I understand why you're skeptical about the lockdowns. In some cases, I can empathize with it to some extent, but the people who are going to get hurt are your parents, your grandparents, your loved ones, the elders in the community, ideally the pinnacles of wisdom. And it's weird. It's weirdly dehumanizing how it's exactly those people that we should have, the most respect and care for, that we're turning our backs on at exactly this point. And it's exactly also, there's a huge crisis in leadership, like you're saying. The other side of asking who are you going to vote for, of course, is like, what's the sort of slate of candidates and perspectives available? And the problem is, I can't really find, and this is obvious, you can't find the right perspective. There's no voice, and it's so frustrating. It's so frustrating. Again, it's this feeling of being lost and moreless without this sort of guidance. And I think people are responding to that feeling. They're trying to, move out into the streets in different ways and express their agitation. But unfortunately, again, I'm segueing slightly. I don't know what that's actually going to turn to. What I want from these protests, what I want from any civil unrest, and what anybody should want, I think, is some productive, positive outcome.
Yes.
Either you don't do the thing because it's going to be bad, or you do the thing and you take on the risks in the knowledge that you're going to achieve something good. The problem is, I don't see how we're actually going to do that. What's the policy platform? If the BLM movement turns into a wider economic unrest movement, I am very curious, and I'm a little bit optimistic, but I'm not mostly optimistic about what that policy platform is going to be. But I think that this next generation of leaders is going to have to respond to that. And so in that sense, it's very careful. I think we need to be very prudent about how we set up those policies, about doing it in the right way. That's my take, at least. What do you think?
I agree with you, I think. I mean, I think I'm more hopeful than I think you sound, if that makes sense. What I mean by that is, the argument to defund the police, I think is slightly askew. If I look at stats, and I look at some of the statistics and some of the research, it becomes very clear, something jumps out at you, that the issue is poverty. And what I mean by that is, it is true that you should do things to curtail the lengths of the police ability to basically kill and injure, their killability factor, and what we allow and what we accept in ranges of action in regards to killable. But if you really want to get down to it, those police, if you want to get rid of them, you get rid of the reason that they're there. And your society has basically created a situation where you have 3 people who own half as much wealth as everybody else. That's appalling. Just from just general terms. You have a massive income inequality gap where you have some people who are living in desperate poverty that our society accepts. Well, if you have people in desperate poverty, what do? You have to throw in cops, right? You have to keep some level of order because those things kind of incentivize crime. Even inequality, you can see the violence level go up as inequality increases. And so it's like, if you want to get rid of that stuff, I ask, are there cops roaming around killing people in Beverly Hills? The answer is no. I have to ask, okay, why not? And one of the things that I see it is like, is it something to do with the cash? And is it possible that if we have statistically show that richer neighborhoods have less crime, less people taking their lives, less people or living longer, less infant mortality rate, less kids who are having brain deformities because of the poverty that they're enduring and creating kind of learning disabilities. If I know that the outcomes are better in that neighborhood and I say, all right, what if I make this neighborhood wealthier? Would that put that in that box? Would get this out of the other box of income inequality? The answer, of course, is yes. It's like the answer to defund the cops is to do so organically by basically getting rid of the poverty that incentivizes those cops and being in that community in the first place. So I understand what you mean when you say, will it grow into something wider? I think it will. I mean, it has to. If you think of what's taking place next month, the housing crisis, you're going to have a situation where evictions take place in mass. And those evictions are also going to join those people who no longer are getting that $600. I was reading articles on this. The levels of people who are going to be out on their homes. 30% of the people didn't pay their rent last month in June or this month. That's astonishing. That number is only going to get worse. So it's like, are those people who are going to be on the streets are going to join Black Lives Matter protesters? Maybe, yeah. So I do have some level of hope in this. Like I said, a little bit more hope than I think you sound.
I just want I want the motivation these people have. I want it to become coherent. And yes. I think we're starting to see signs of that. Like, I've seen some very good policy proposals on criminal justice reform, for instance. Now, they're kind of hard to find, but I've seen them, and it's very clear that they're coming out of this movement. What I want is that wave of concrete policy recommendations, and then we can get into that. You know what I mean? As a society, I think that's where we need to be. I think even we're going to go into a break in just a second here, but even the conversation of poverty, wealth is hard to create. Wealth takes a long time to create, and we need to learn how to create that wealth. I think so much emphasis is put on solving poverty, but really the way you do that is by creating wealth. And how do we do that in an equitable way? How do we do that in a way that's good for our whole society? I think that's the real question. But I want to come back to that. We're just about to go into a break. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Fault Lines.
Yo, Deshaun, what do you want to talk about today?
Well, Bob, that's easy. I want to talk about the need to stop the development of self-driving cars.
Again, Sean, you're driving me nuts. I think the self-driving car thing's already out of the gate.
No, it's never too late. See, now the leading experts in the field, just pick one, whichever one, leading experts have repeatedly warned us about the dangers of artificial intelligence. Look, I'm telling you, man, we have to stop the robots by any means necessary.
I see what you did there.
Yep.
Tune into our show By Any Means Necessary daily from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Time on Radio Sputnik. And don't forget to call in at 3:20 p.m. to our studio number 202-521-1320.
And if you miss us live, check us out on SputnikNews.com, Spreaker, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts to stay up to date on the latest political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Fault lines.
And we are back. You are listening right now to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, our third day on the air after a massive changeover last week. We're going to be taking calls this segment. We're also going to be talking about, I'm assuming, continuing that last conversation on wealth and poverty a little bit. I also wanted to maybe talk about Ghislaine Maxwell and Epstein. I was also watching.
Oh, yeah.
Have you seen, Jamal, did you ever watch the Prince Andrew interview? It was about 7 months ago. It's like a 45-minute long interview.
I can't believe he thought that was okay.
Yeah.
He nailed it. No, buddy,
I'm
you didn't nail it.
I hadn't watched that until just within the last couple of days, and I had to stop myself at a couple of points just because it was so uncomfortable.
Yes.
How obvious this thing was. He says something, he steps it back. He says something, he steps it back, and it's just like a ratcheting up of tension. Anyway, 202-521-1320 is the number to call.
Yeah, he was so out of touch. He ended that nailed it. It's no, dude, you need to be in prison. That was horrible interview.
That's the thing. No, that's the thing. Yeah, I that's the thing. I'd heard about it. I came back to it. I want to get into it. Ideally, we can get Whitney Webb or somebody on later. Because again, as you talked about in headlines, Ghislaine Maxwell apparently living in Paris in a luxe apartment or something. And again, Eric Weinstein, kind of notorious dude, intellectual dark web dude. Anyway, I was watching a video of his. He made a couple of good points. And the first thing, he said the big question everybody should be asking that no journalist is asking about the Epstein story. We have. Yeah. But what about the intelligence agencies?
Right.
Why haven't any quote unquote establishment journalists, why haven't any authoritative journalists, whatever that means, with the cachet, why haven't they asked the intelligence agencies, do you have any knowledge of this? Have you ever engaged in these activities? Were you aware of his activities? Because even if you get that no comment, even if they give a non-committal response, that's a huge response. But we just, as far as I know, we haven't gotten that.
Or even ask, why haven't you arrested Ghislaine Maxwell? For God's sake, they put Epstein in prison. And our prison system, which was supposed to be able to keep somebody alive, but for whatever reason, the cameras were down. The guy didn't hear him apparently trying to off himself. All of this weird stuff supposed to have taken place. But they did put him in prison, right? And so under some notion, it's he's guilty. So if the person he was working with was Ghislaine Maxwell, how on earth is that woman just walking around like nothing happened? That's astonishing to me. Yeah,
it turned into the Epstein didn't kill himself meme, and I admit that was a good meme. But I just worry that that's kind of where it stopped. I'm curious where this story is going to go. I'm glad to see that this is still being reported on because again, this just came out in the last day that she's living there.
Yeah.
But we'll see. Anyway, we do have callers at this point. We have a few of them. Let's go with Michael from Sydney first. Michael, what's on your mind this morning?
Yeah, hey guys. Look, I was just listening to the intro there from yourself and Jamal about poverty being linked to crime, and I think one of the ways, there are many ways you can basically reduce poverty, and one of them is to redistribute wealth. Yeah. Now that can take many forms in the form of handouts, a basic income, universal income. You also have to do things like improve the infrastructure, improve the transport.
By the way, something simple like putting up a bus stop. I know this, for example, I agree with you. For example, recently when we did the $600, doesn't sound like much, right? But it reduced poverty. How insane! Just giving people $600. That something that small was able to basically keep people income relatively stable. Just during the course of the crisis, even though it was patchy. I'm sorry, I was just agreeing with you.
Also, I mean, like, if you give like a poor person money, they will spend all of it.
Yes.
You give like Jeff Bezos $1 billion, he's not going to spend it. He's going to buy stocks or some investment. It's not actually going to create any wealth. It's just going to sit in the financial. I mean, Karl Marx defined the financial sector of the economy as being totally useless. He said it doesn't produce any wealth. The financial sector is not a wealth-creating industry. Right? All it does is circulate money, and people scalp. I mean, like the Robin Hood. You should get Max Kaiser on your program. He's a great guy. I watch everything he puts out on RT, and then he can tell you that all the financial fraud. And you say there's no crime. I bet if you went into Manhattan and you audited all the people in there and actually did the proper audit, you'd find hidden tax shelters. You'd find they were involved in this scam and that scam, and they'd all be in jail. But the police never arrest them because they've got contacts in the political parties who all receive donations from it. So they don't go to jail. There's crime in Manhattan. It's just 10 levels, 20 levels above the street that they're not cracking down on.
I agree with you. Shane?
Yeah, and just one quick comment on the sort of the financialization aspect of that. I want to talk to Tom Luongo about this later because I actually think he'd have an opinion.
Yeah,
but my impression of this is, if you look at Great Britain, I'm going to go back to Great Britain in the 19th century. They had a fiat currency. We are now the world's fiat currency.
Yes.
The point here is, if you look at where are the big centers of finance in the world right now, it's London and New York. Then you could say maybe Hong Kong, although that's in question, obviously, with all the turmoil. My point is, it's like the big centers of finance are directly linked to the in some sense, the capitals, clearly with the UK and arguably, figuratively with the US, the capitals of these countries with this fiat currency. And it's these larger cycles that I'm really curious about. But again, this question of how do we return to more productive capacity? How do we get back into stuff like manufacturing? I think that's hugely, hugely important. And yeah, I was just sort of riffing on that, Michael, but I want to talk to Tom later about that. Maybe we can go deeper into what causes over-financialization.
Oh, that's straightforward. You mean wealth. I mean, like when you made the point that says wealth creation is one of those things. Oh, I'm not sure if we have to call it. Thank you. I appreciate the call, man. I'm not sure. Look, the wealth creation thing is easy, right? I mean, over the course of time, we get it to a fine science because Jeff Bezos is going to have $1 trillion. And the United States is the richest country ever on the face of the planet that is ever seen. And yet we have income inequality greater than anything we've ever seen. And even
is that wealth creation?
China, wealth
is
creation.
That's the thing. Is that wealth creation or money creation? That's the question.
But that is wealth. I mean, that is people with massive amounts of means. The only difference is that means is kept to a very few bit of hands. I mean, I think that's the issue, right? Like, for example, do we have really any issue making sure that everyone eats on the globe? No. I mean, we have the technological capability to provide all of that stuff. That's not even in question. The issue is always, how do people get fabulously wealthy all across? And there's no way to do that. There's no way for capitalism to have this class that everybody succeeds. It's impossible. I mean, you basically need an underclass. That 40% is necessary for that other percent. Like, a perfect example, Obama. Obama gave 95% of the income gains to the top 1%. That same stat, you can see at the exact same time, Obama created 95% of the jobs that he created were poor or low income jobs. Same time. And it's like, that's interesting. He created 95% went to the top of 1%, and 95% of the jobs he created were low income. That's not a feat. That's not a bug. That's a feature. That's just kind of part and parcel. Like, if I hire somebody, I have to pay that person less if I want to make more, just by definition. So how do you have go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, you're good. No, here's my take. I want to go to the other two callers here.
Yeah.
But here's my take is, I see that as giving the reins of control. If you do the quantitative easing stuff and if it gets redistributed, however, if it trickles up, however you want to look at it, it's not like more actual things, like wealth in a real sense is being created. It's just you're printing money, you're doling that money out, either informally or formally, and then that money is representing a greater share of power in the various institutions that govern our world. You know what I mean? That's my take on it. But
I agree. No, I totally agree. Totally agree.
Okay.
No disagreement with that.
Want to go to two other callers here. First, we're going to Tarif from New Orleans. Tarif.
Oh, Tarif.
What's on your mind?
What's going on, man?
Good morning, gentlemen. I have two comments dealing with Black Lives Matter. The first comment is dealing with, I saw something over the weekend well, from Syrian girl, how she was saying the Black Lives Matter movement is being hijacked.
They're trying
And
to.
she put together a piece that's 12 minutes long, and I took it and I linked it to the show today for Fort Lauderdale Radio tweet today underneath it. And the second comment, so over the weekend I did my research on the payment processes, and when I looked at Act Blue, I don't know if Act Blue is acting as a personal bank account for Black Lives Matter, but they also attach to DNC. So if a group of people give $10 million, is that money going to Black Lives Matter? So I found another group that's processing money called like Raise the Money. And what they do, they process your money, then the next day they give it to your bank account, which is a good thing, because if people want to audit like Black Lives Matter to see, okay, if I give you $10 million, is it actually going to what I'm giving for, for like justice or whatever? Whereas if you attach to the DNC, whereas the Act Blue is attached to the DNC, is that money being bundled and transferred over somewhere else? Because that wouldn't be fair. That's like happened to Bernie Sanders. Remember when people gave over $200 million and it's supposed to be going to Bernie Sanders, but yet later on it went to the DNC? So I was just trying to, do my little research, and I stumbled upon that. So that's all I wanted to say this morning.
That's fair, but keep in mind, Act Blue, I don't think they're entirely for the DNC, even though they're associated with the DNC. Like, if that makes sense, they may be for multiple groups, even though the DNC is just the main
That sounds
idea.
like a distinction without a difference. I mean, if they're for the DNC.
Oh, really? You think so?
Yeah. I mean, that's the thing. I would need to look into them a little bit more, but it's just, they're probably just a democratic organization in a capital D democratic sense. That's my impression.
I don't know that. Yeah, I don't know that. I mean, like it's like if I had, I don't know, if I had an organization that gave money to groups, I don't know, like what's some of those fundraising things, and you just had a major group that's associated with it. Does that mean that it's only the major group? I got to be honest though, I don't know, to be honest. So I'm not entirely sure. So we have one more caller though. Let's go to the caller. What's the gentleman's name?
Louise.
Perfect. How's it going,
Louise
Louise?
from Virginia.
Yes. Good morning, Shane and Jamal. And I'm not a gentleman. Is there any way someone like myself who does not have access to a computer can either write you or leave a recorded message on a suggestion recorded message box? Either way. Otherwise, I'll have to say it on air.
Say it on air.
All right. I have a complaint about your boss, Mindy Gava Shelley. 2 complaints.
Okay,
One,
wait. Okay.
Well,
Wait. Leave that. Okay. We'll let you call that one in, because I think this is going to go in a particular direction. So let me let you call that one into the show. I mean, I guess there's a call-in thing anywhere, Shane?
Yeah, you can also do fault lines. Pardon me, you said you don't have a computer. I will give the email out, faultlinesradio@gmail.com. With a phone number, that's a little bit more difficult. We need to set one of those up. We want to set up a hotline or something like that people can call into. It's something we've been talking about, but sadly, we do not have that right now. Sad to say. Regardless, though, interesting conversation.
Yes.
And actually, yeah, there was one other thing. There's something Tyree was saying that I wanted to come back to. Oh, yeah, he was talking about Maram's video, Black Lives Matter as a color revolution. We're going to get into that. We're actually going to be talking about that with Tom a little bit later. He's coming on at 8:30, and I think we're going to be talking about that in that first segment. So, Tarif, if you wanted to get back into that or hear more about that, we're going to be talking about that a little bit later. Briefly, I can see why people are saying that. However, I also don't want to. I see legitimate points that the movement's making. Slavery existed. We didn't really deal with it appropriately, and we're still living under the consequences of that.
Yeah,
and
I think
that's my personal take. But
yeah,
we'll get into it with Tom. I want to get into it.
No, I don't think it's a revolution. But go ahead. Yeah, we can have that argument.
For sure, yeah. Anyway, actually, we're about to go into a break. We're going to be back in just a minute with Alex Prainer. We're going to be talking about Bill Browder, going over the sort of basics of that story, going over the 101. We're also going to be talking about this Southern District of New York Attorney General Jeff Berman, who just got fired in a kind of roundabout way. We'll be coming back to talk about that more in just a minute. Right now, you've been listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Fault lines.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
What's the most important hour of the day? It's the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon. On this show, we don't just deliver the latest headlines. We divide the real from the fake. Tune in to hear from some of the most brilliant political minds of today. Get in-depth news and analysis that goes beyond the surface and digs straight into the details. Set your clock to the Critical Hour for a news perspective unlike any of those other guys. Tune in to the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon, weekdays 6 to 7 p.m. Eastern, and catch us on Facebook Live. You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Fault lines.
And we're back. You've been listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We're joined now by Alex Craner. Alex is a hedge fund manager and the author of The Grand Deception. It's a book about Bill Browder. It got banned from Amazon after Bill Browder came down on Amazon, although I don't think they had good reason to take it down. We'll get into that in a few minutes. We're going to go over the sort of basics of the Bill Browder story again. This is a significant story. We're going to get into it. I wanted to talk with Alex about this resignation that happened this weekend in the Southern District of New York, where former Attorney General Jeffrey Berman, just stepped down. And it was this weird thing where on Friday night, Barr issued a press release basically calling for his resignation, saying that he would be resigning. Then he put out his own little thing on Twitter saying, I didn't get this. I'm not going to be resigning, even though he was responding to a press release. So it's a little bit weird. Then the next day, apparently Trump wrote a letter, although Trump distanced himself from it, saying that it was on Barr's end. Anyway, it ended with Jeff Berman actually resigning. Now, this is relevant to the Browder case in one main way, which is Preet Bharara, who was overseeing the Prevezon case, which was how Natalia Veselnitskaya came to the States. It was sort of, other than Bill Browder himself, it was when the Magnitsky Act and all this stuff and all of these financial shenanigans that were going, it's when we saw that stuff come into the United States. It's when our legal system started to review those documents. Anyway, Preet Bharara preceded Jeffrey Berman, and there seems to be some through line, some continuity in their approaches to things, with Jeff Berman going after Rudy Giuliani on this Ukraine Gate stuff. Anyway, I don't understand that completely, but I wanted to talk to Alex about it. Alex, how are you doing this morning?
Yeah, I'm doing great. Thank you. Thank you for having me. How are you doing?
I'm good. Yeah, I'm good. Things have been interesting with this show turnover, but yeah, things have been going well so far. So first off, I just laid out that thing with Jeff Berman. Had you heard about that? Do you have any opinion on what happened there?
Yeah, I have heard about it. Unfortunately, I haven't had time to get into depth of what exactly happened, but I'm aware that Jeffrey Berman is the new Preet Bharara. And one thing that I've noticed through my research over the years is that Southern District of New York is the place where it's like a carve out of the U.S. justice system, where the prosecutors, defense attorneys, and judges all feed at the same trough. And I've noticed that all the politically sensitive cases end up there if the outcome of the case needs to be controlled. And of course, the Prevezon case was one of these examples. And I think that the remarkable thing about the Prevezon case here is that the state attorneys actually failed to make the case stick to Prevezon and to captive. And so basically what they had was a settlement where captive was obliged to pay $6 million to the U.S. Attorneys. But that was essentially a face-saving defeat. And the case was brought to the U.S. attorneys and to the Southern District of New York by none other than Bill Browder. And Bill Browder is the man who cooked up the new Cold War between Russia and the United States, and who pushed through the infamous Magnitsky Act, which is considered to be the opening salvo of the new Cold War against Russia. And the importance of this event, of all these events, can be seen. I think perhaps the best way to put this was done by former German Foreign Minister Sigmar Gabriel, who basically said in an interview that what happened is a complete shattering of the relationship between Russia and the West, and that this was the greatest threat to peace across the globe. So this is a hugely important geopolitical affair that's kind of going in the shadows of the deep state, that most people don't quite understand the importance of it, but it is one of the greatest threats to the world peace. And the reason why I ended up writing my book is because I thought that these events, if they're allowed to metastasize and are not exposed, that they could eventually lead us to World War III.
I think you're absolutely right about that. And so a lot of people are just coming to this story. Jamal, I think you were telling me you've been loosely following it, but you're not too familiar with the details or why it's so important, right?
Well, I saw. I've spoken to Lee about it in the past, and not just from the standpoint of the Der Spiegel article on kind of going through how all of
that
this
was what you were saying.
The Der Spiegel article was. I put it this way: it's mind blowing that an article like that can run and it gets no raised eyebrows. You know what I mean? Like it's because that's in a mainstream media outlet, and for them to run that article pretty kind of makes the point that this is a real case. But in the United States, that's not considered. That's not necessarily considered a real case, even though it is. All laws and everything has been passed based on Browder's and his testimony. Browder looked pretty horrible. So I know a little bit about the case, but I haven't been following it entirely. Significantly. So let me ask you this. Why would you consider this to be such a significant case? Like when you say that the world itself has been put on notice because of what has taken place in regards to Browder, how does the Browder case evolve into something of that level of significance?
Well, I think that Browder's assignment is to make sure that there can be no cooperation between the United States and Russia, which to my mind is it's not an easy thing to explain, but I actually think that the fault lines, as the title of your show is appropriately called, the fault lines of today's geopolitical struggle is precisely the British Empire versus the rest of humanity. And now, when you say British Empire, people are surprised because they think that this is some vestige of the distant past, but it's not. The British Empire spent and exhausted itself by World War I and then through World War II. But the structures of powers have simply co-opted the United States governing establishment and have proceeded with the agenda by using the United States as their geopolitical military muscle. And that involves the large and ballooning military-industrial complex and the military overstretch of the empire. And in order to justify all this, you need a great big enemy, right? It used to be the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union collapsed, and then for a while the global war on terror was the boogeyman. But not big enough, not good enough. Terrorists are not a nuclear superpower, right? So the re-emergent Russia was again baptized into the new great Satan, the great enemy of the United States. And so this is the big enemy against whom you can have another buildup of the geopolitical tensions, of war threats, and so you can continue to justify enormous military expenditure. And this is the game that has been played for over a century now. And if there would be a reapproachment between Russia and the United States, if the hostilities were to die down and the relationship evolved more in the direction of friendship and cooperation, then it would be very difficult to continue justifying the the huge military outlays and the growth of the empire and the military bases all over the world and so forth. In addition to that, you have two very, very different models of societal arrangements and economic growth. On the one hand, you could grow by what the Chinese are apparently attempting to do with the Belt and Road Initiative, where you invest in infrastructure, you promote trade, and you promote endogenous economic growth, where most of the countries of the world and most of the communities evolve into prosperity, growth, commerce, trade between nations, and cooperation. Or you can have the British model where you're essentially colonizing all the rest of the world, in which case you're the empire, you have to have no rivals whatsoever. So all the rivals have to be destroyed. It's the old model of the Holy Roman Empire. Now you can be the only person, the only power in the world. And then what you're doing is you're turning every other corner of the world into a source of cheap labor or slave labor, and resources to be extracted and strip mined from everywhere.
No, Alex, I do understand. You're basically, we're a capitalistic system, and we need cheap labor and resources, like Guatemala or like for example, Iran, the coups and whatnot that we were pushing through. In many of those cases, we were put in a dictator to expropriate the resources. But question real quick. You made the point of saying that when I asked you how was he intimately involved in kind of creating the system of destabilization between the United States and Russia, and you said that his purpose from who? Are you saying that he's an element or he's a factor of some militaristic company or something in order to destabilize, or is he working on his own?
No, he's almost certainly not working on his own. He's working for a network of power that I believe ultimately the chain of control and command hierarchy leads to the banking cartel, which is centered in the city of London and Wall Street. And so they are, this banking cartel owns the controlling stake in most of the military-industrial complex corporations, and so I think that they are also his employer. Well, his partner in crime is HSBC Bank, right? They are his partner and his key investor. They took over from Edmund Safra, who was the owner of Republic National Bank of New York. And they also, they have so much power that at a given moment in time, they can have the British Prime Minister, Tony Blair, go and intervene on Bill Browder's behalf with the Russians. What I just mentioned didn't actually happen. This was supposed to happen in a St. Petersburg G8 meeting in, I think,
let's wrap in a minute,
8 or 9 or something like this. It didn't happen because then there was a war between Israel and Lebanon. But it goes to tell you that, like one hedge fund manager who at peak managed about $4 billion worth of investment funds, it sounds like a lot of money, but in the hedge fund industry, that's small. That's not even very important. To get the British Prime Minister to intervene on your behalf is not something that is given to any hedge fund manager. So, you have a class of hedge fund managers who really run their businesses as a cover for geopolitical influence. And then they're connected to intelligence agencies who work in cooperation. And I think that if you connect the dots, pretty much there's a strong cooperation between the typical Western intelligence agencies like the MI6 CIA, the Mossad, the German intelligence agency, Italian, Swedish, and so forth. And they all work in this network that pretty much perpetuates the British Empire model of dominating the whole world and all of humanity. and the objective is essentially to turn the whole world into a source of cheap labor force and resources.
That's Alex Craner. We're going to be back in just a minute with Alex. Alex is the author of the book, The Grand Deception. It's a book about Bill Browder, who we're speaking about right now. We're also talking about the implications of Browder's actions in Russia. We're going to be talking more about that in just a minute. And I have a couple questions for Alex, but that's on the other side of the break right now. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Fault Lines. By Any Means Necessary is your guide to the movement and efforts shaping the world around us, from mass incarceration.
No longer am I interested in or concerned with prison reform. I am interested only in the eradication of prisons.
To the battle between police and water protectors.
It was a pretty punishing disregard for the sanctity of human life, that unleashing water cannons on peaceful, prayerful water protectors.
From efforts to protect the environment.
The climate movement is ready to, with plenty of opposition research and force and strength, along with, the right of both science and morality, to fight them on this.
To the movement for Black Lives.
When I first saw the Michael Brown video, and I saw that it clearly contradicted the narrative put forth by the Ferguson Police Department and by police supporters in general, 3 words came to mind: color me shocked.
Stay tuned to By Any Means Necessary, 5 days a week here on Radio Sputnik. Fault Lines.
And we're back. We're joined now by Alex Craner. Alex Craner is a hedge fund manager and the author of the book, The Grand Deception. It's a book about Bill Browder. It's also a book about this larger, as you're just talking about, this sort of larger existential battle between 2 competing models of growth and development in the world, I think. And I like that sort of wide lens, wide angle perspective on this. Here's what I think we should do. I think it makes sense for people who don't know anything about the guy, who don't know anything about what we're talking about. I think now that we've established why it's important, at the very least now we should go back and actually talk about what happened. So first off, one thing real quick, Bill Browder's a very interesting guy, not the least of which, the reasons for which is being, he's the grandson of Earl Browder. Earl Browder, a very prominent member of the Communist Party in the USA, who went to the Soviet Union, had a relationship with the Soviets, was ultimately pushed out due to developing his own sort of mixed model in the US. Regardless, though, Bill Browder, as the grandson of this guy, definitely he's talked about how that influenced him. He said he was the rebel. He wanted to go be a capitalist, and he went to go be a capitalist in Russia. And another interesting thing, early in his career, as far as I can tell, he basically got his start in the sort of financial industry working under Robert Maxwell. Now, Robert Maxwell is the same Maxwell. He's the father of Ghislaine Maxwell. So there's this weird connection, including a timeliness, a weird connection to modern stories. Anyway, Browder soon worked with Edmund Safra, who was apparently killed, at least died. He died in a fire. Some people, including me, believe that was likely killing. Again, weird sort of wake that Browder left. Not accusing him of anything, but just saying weird sets of circumstances he went through. And then Browder went to Russia. He, in the 90s, was part of this voucher privatization program. A lot of people have been very critical of basically shock capitalism, going in and picking at the remains of the Soviet Union, trying to pick up any industries. Browder was one of those people. Right. He was soon investigated and gone after by the Russian government. And then it's right about this time, he was doing financial corruption, had to do with these tax fraud programs that he was doing, where he was getting disabled people to work in companies and then getting tax write-offs based on those people working in the companies, even though they weren't doing anything of value. It was basically just a fraud. After the government started to go after him, he, over the course of a couple of years, fled and did a number of weird things. Now, this led to his attorney. Actually, I'm not going to say that. He says his attorney. It was actually his tax advisor, Sergei Magnitsky. This led to his tax advisor, Sergei Magnitsky, being put in jail. Browder said he was his attorney. This is despite Magnitsky having worked for Browder as a tax advisor for years. Magnitsky died in jail. There are all these weird circumstances surrounding Magnitsky's death. We've had Lucy Commissar on to talk about how, even though many people, including Browder, have accused guards in the prison of beating Magnitsky, that's actually not at all the case. Lucy said, I don't know if you've heard this, Alex, that she's gotten pictures that show no beatings, no bruises, nothing. The pictures from the autopsy post-mortem that would basically put to rest these accusations. And again, these are the accusations that Bill Browder's been spreading around the world in order to build up this anti-Russian narrative that you were alluding to. Now, that's the sort of broad picture of the story. Since then, that was in about a little over a decade ago. Since then, he's been a crusader, he calls himself, for human rights around the world. What he's been pushing for are these various Magnitsky Acts. And what these do, and this is actually what I want to ask you about, Alex, because I'm just starting to sort of get how this works. What these Magnitsky Acts do is they let countries sanction individuals from other countries. They let them freeze the assets of individuals from other countries. Now, I didn't get what mattered, like why that mattered, why that was significant. Now I have a theory, and I want to get your opinion on that theory. What I see happening is when these countries seize when they implement these sanctions, when they seize those assets, what happens with those assets is basically banks, entities like HSBC, and I'll use HSBC as the prime example, they will buy those assets at a profit. They'll make money from that. So in a weird way, and I want to get your opinion on this, it seems like Browder, through these Magnitsky Acts, has set associates of his in the form of these institutions up to make a lot of money. I wanted to get your take on that. Have you heard about that idea?
Well, at a risk of answering the wrong question, because, okay, so basically what happened is that during the, I'll try to give it a bit more context, okay? Go back into the past, into the 90s when Russia was transitioning from quote-unquote communism to quote-unquote capitalism. Russia was basically overran by Western investors, bankers, advisors, lawyers, how do you call it, tax advisors and so forth. And they all concocted this big system in which they extracted an enormous amount of wealth out of Russia. Paintings, gold, silver, oil, you name it, but most importantly, shares, ownership in the companies that produced all this wealth, because Russia is enormously resource-rich country. It has the most highly educated population in the world, and it was very important for these Western financial and corporate raiders to gain and retain control over the ownership of all these assets, right? And so between $200 and $600 billion of this real wealth was stolen from Russia and taken overseas under control of Western financial funds and banks and corporations and so forth. And so basically when Putin came to power, he and his government started slowly to investigate and trace these funds and to try to find any illegal transfers of ownership and to try to reverse and get their family jewels back under their own control. And so the Magnitsky Act sanctions, the Magnitsky Act enables different Western countries to impose sanctions on companies and individuals without any due process. This is a very unique feature in the Western judicial system, that you can sanction people without any due process, without any recourse. And basically the objective to me seemed from the beginning to completely frustrate the Russian attempts to investigate and recover their stolen assets. And so, because what happens is if a Russian entity, a state entity, or a private investigator or somebody brings a court case to London or to New York or to Washington and so forth, then there's like a judicial process that starts to happen where you would file certain documents, you would request certain documents, you would depose certain witnesses and actors and so forth, and you start building a paper trail and a record that cannot easily be deleted and reversed. So these the Magnitsky Act sanctions basically enable somebody from out of the we know now that it's the people who are put on the list of Magnitsky Act to be sanctioned comes from the United States Treasury. So some unnamed bureaucrat in the U.S. Treasury can simply put a person on the person of sanction list, invent a reason that somehow they are not sufficiently sensitive to human rights issues, and then this person's assets can be frozen. Their visa can be revoked, or they cannot obtain a U.S. visa, and then they're immediately frustrated if they want to come to London or New York or wherever, cooperate with the local law offices and file a case or be a witness. They're immediately disabled and disqualified as like a human rights abuser. So I think that this is the true purpose of these sanctions, and you can also see evidence that this is being used. Like for example, the former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, Marie Yovanovitch, was revoking or disallowing visas to Ukrainians who wanted to come to the United States and to testify about Democratic Party corruption in Ukraine. So by using these visa sanctions, she was able to keep them from testifying before Congress or U.S. courts. And you also had a similar case where United States imposed visa sanctions on the investigators of the International Criminal Court. This was reported this year. So Pompeo was saying that the visa restrictions are used to deter International Criminal Court's efforts to pursue alleged personnel, including Israelis, for war crimes. So these types of sanctions are basically used to nullify various cooperation treaties where these war crimes, criminal cases, and so forth could be pursued and brought to justice.
That makes a lot of sense. That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, no, Jamal, I didn't want to cut you off. I just want to say that makes a lot of sense. That perspective of frustrating officials, that perspective of using this to basically just put a thorn into other countries' sides when it's politically useful, or like you're saying at the end there, to suppress opinions that you don't want to have expressed. That makes perfect sense.
Yeah, it makes sense. I guess I don't entirely see the connection between how Browder specifically as an individual and things that he may be doing to avoid jail terms. Meaning, he lied. That seems to be clear at this point. How do you determine the difference between somebody doing something entirely for their own self-interest as opposed to the larger concerns of, let's say, a capitalistic class that wants to maintain chaos and havoc between the two countries in order to avoid peaceful relations for profit seeking?
Well, from his point of view, obviously he has an incentive to do certain things for his own benefit, for the benefit of his own investors, and that part of the game clearly exists, and it's real and it's there. But I think that it all functions within a much larger agenda. How would I explain that? I would explain it by the fact that if you have a hedge fund manager who goes to Russia to make investments to make money, he does that. He runs into a conflict with the local law because he was engaged in tax fraud. Would have to either face investigations or 1 minute, or he would have to leave Russia and escape. But that once his career as a hedge fund manager is over, he can go and lobby the largest superpower in the world into passing a completely fraudulent piece of legislation. 40. That requires a different explanation. That cannot be any more part of the agenda of him just going to 30. Russia for investment opportunities and making a little bit of money. That's a much, much bigger story. And then based on the fraudulent story of Sergei Magnitsky, the lawyer who was a lawyer, and about the fight for human justice and human rights.
Alex, we're just going into a break. Great perspective. We're going to be back in just a minute here. That was Alex Craner, hedge fund manager and author of The Grand Deception. We'll be back in just a minute. You've been listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Guys, keep watching the clock.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault Lines.
And we are back. Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, the most disruptive show on American radio. In the right corner, or in the independent corner, I'll say. I am investigative analyst Shane Stranahan.
And in the rowdy, unapologetic lefty corner, it is Jamal Thomas.
You are listening to the most disruptive show in the galaxy. I just said America's radio, but it's the galaxy. It's Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. All right, in the news, we're going to be talking about a couple of stories today. We've already covered some of this stuff. I'll briefly throw in the stuff we've already covered. Ghislaine Maxwell her location has been identified. She is apparently living in a Lux Paris apartment. It's weird that this is coming out right now, and it's weird that it's coming out at all. But I just wanted to throw that in there, especially because we were just talking, again, about Bill Browder with connections to Robert Maxwell, who was the father of Ghislaine Maxwell, the mistress of Jeffrey Epstein, part of the larger Epstein story. Last night in Charlotte, there was a attack that killed 2 people, left 12 wounded, happened about midnight. Apparently it was at a block party, and dozens of cop cars, I heard as many as 30 cop cars arrived, many ambulances. So this was a big event, happened in the middle of the night.
That's amazing.
Apparently people were shot, and then multiple cars were ramming people. So multiple cars, that's what I heard.
How did that happen? I didn't entirely understand what that meant. So why were the cars ramming?
I have no clue, and that's the thing is a lot of info seems to be still coming out. Most of the stories were published just before we went on air this morning, as far as I can tell. But it's confusing. I'm curious. You get curious about how or whether that's connected to the wider stuff that's going on, or if it was just a fluke.
Yeah, we can cover it tomorrow. I mean, we can go further into detail on it tomorrow once we see the story.
Absolutely, and maybe if more info comes out during the show, we can talk about that too.
Yeah.
Also, this weekend, Southern District of New York, we also just talked about this story a bit. Southern District of New York Attorney General Jeffrey Berman resigned. This came after a sort of back and forth where on Friday night.
Let's put that in quotes.
I suppose we should. Yeah. So, this is a really weird thing that happened. On Friday night, Barr called for his resignation in a public press release. He didn't even call for it. He said he's resigning. Then Jeffrey Berman on Twitter posted, "This is the first I've heard of this. I'm not resigning." His qualification there, by the way, I need to be clear. He's saying he needed to know who was going to replace him. It just turned out it was a person immediately below him who replaced him. Anyway, on Saturday, Trump apparently ended up sending a letter, although Trump distanced himself from it, saying that it was Barr's business. Anyway, it ended with Jeffrey Berman resigning. This is significant partly because Jeffrey was a longstanding critic. He was investigating the Trump administration. He was looking into Rudy Giuliani, looking into this Ukraine Gate stuff. So it's significant in its own right. We were also just talking about Alex Craner, about this weird continuity in the Southern District of New York, what the district seems to be doing. And the last AG down there, Preet Bharara, who was involved in the Prevezon case, which we were, we just talked about with Alex Craner.
Yeah.
In other news, so the Trump rally took place this Saturday. This was a big, supposedly big rally.
1 million people. 1 million people.
Yeah.
1 million people, Shane.
Almost a 20,000 seat stadium. When I saw it happening, I thought, okay, it's going to be maybe a little bit low. I was watching. Headlines starting to trickle in. And then I was like, okay, half capacity, that's pretty low. And then a couple hours later, it was like, no, 6,000, so less than a third capacity. Yeah. Brad Parscale, Trump campaign manager, pretty quickly came out saying that protesters were at fault. Protesters were blocking metal detectors. Then Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, AOC, came out and basically put the blame or the benefit on Zoomers, on the young generation, exactly, the young becoming mature generation. Zoomers and K-pop fans who apparently flooded TikTok, the app TikTok, basically signing up for the Trump campaign event. boosting the numbers, hogging tickets. Anyway, Brad Parscale responded saying that they have procedures in place to weed out phony requests, including like identifying their phone numbers and stuff. Here's the thing, though, Republican strategist, I'll just use this as a highlight or an example. Republican strategist Steve Schmidt says his daughter and friends had hundreds of tickets, quote, end quote, which, yeah, I think means they didn't actually manage to weed out the
weeding out all that well, yeah. They're going to fire that guy. Right.
That's exactly right. And then, the one other big story I want to talk about today, this is coming up. Trump and Putin are going to be having a meeting later today in Vienna, Austria. They're going to be talking about the New START Treaty, which is an anti-nuclear treaty, basically a nuclear, not disarmament, but nuclear easing treaty, prohibiting the building of new bases, nuclear weapons, et cetera, in Russia and the USA. Trump is saying that he wants Xi from China, Xi Jinping, to join. Putin is saying that he's happy to keep going with just this regular treaty. We'll see what happens. This is something that got signed into law under Obama, the second one, after the original START treaty, just now called START 1. It's all complicated, I guess, signed by Reagan. Anyway, this one, if it goes into place, we'll see what happens with it. We'll see what they change around. It's due to end in February. So that's the sort of timeliness. That's part of why it's happening right now. But we'll see what comes out of that.
I don't know. I don't think people realize how disturbing this is. Like, we're talking about John Bowden's book. John Bowden just came out with his book. And, from John Bowden's perspective, no missile treaty or the United States shouldn't engage in any of these treaties. And so when he was in the Trump administration, what do you know? Donald Trump starts pulling out of one treaty after the next. And here's another one where he's trying to argue, I want China involved. Well, that treaty is between Russia and the United States. What in the world? How are you trying to pull China involved into this kind of treaty? And on some level, I guess I get it. China and Russia are allies. But by the same token, that's like them saying, well, okay, fine. If China's going to be involved, we want Britain, all of Europe, et cetera, et cetera. You know what I mean? Like, how are you pulling in other countries involved to a treaty that was basically a treaty between the United States and Russia?
I mean, I can see that. I need to learn more about China's nuclear capabilities at this point. Because like you were saying, I need to look into it more. But if they don't have that many, if it's really not that big of a threat, then it just seems like an optics thing.
90% is from the United States and Russia.
Yeah, that's the thing. No, that matches my memory exactly. I don't know. It's a good question. You can always adapt these things over time, but like you're saying, this was rooted in the Cold War with that old divide. Granted, though, we are moving into this new sort of multilateral era. I mean, China, Russia, and the U.S., along with the European Union or the UK, or however you want to split it up. Regardless, China, Russia, and the U.S., these are, I think, seen as the main military competitors. And so from a nuclear perspective, I could see it making sense.
I mean, it's not that I can't see it. It's just, if the United States is going to come in and say, okay, I want this, isn't it fair also for Russia to turn around and say, well, fine, we want these other countries that you are friends and allies with to be a part of it. And we also want you to push back the NATO countries because, you said you weren't going to encroach our borders and you're encroaching our borders. I guess I'm making the point that the moment that you turn around and start adding things into a treaty, it also opens up where the other countries should be able to add things also. I mean, it's like the invocation of China when 90% of the missiles are between the United States and Russia just seems unfair. I mean, China is not going to curtail its growth, especially from the standpoint of a nuclear deterrent, when the United States is building bases in Taiwan, is building bases in Japan, it has nuclear. That's insane. Think about, for the moment, what the United States has been doing. The United States has turned around and said China is going to be an economic juggernaut, and we want to stop them from doing that. So they started using foreign policy as an economic tool. So they would attack Huawei with sanctions. They would attack Russia and Germany, talking about we're going to put sanctions if you're going to open up a gas pipeline. Because why? The U.S. wanted to get themselves involved in those industries. More importantly, though, Taiwan, Japan, these countries are basically nuclear pivot points from the United States. China is an up-and-coming power in this regard. Why should China curtail its nuclear arsenal for, what the United States has is basically already multiple years, decades of nuclear arsenal that was already built up over time? If that country wants to defend itself to some degree, it's going to have to expand. The United States is trying to curtail its ability to grow. If you're China, you're never going to accept that. Why would you? Would the United States accept that?
I don't know. So here's the thing. I'm just hearing from a producer that Russia may be on board with China joining. Then it's just a question of whether China wants to join. And to your valid point, I don't know. I'm in favor of dearmament whenever it makes sense. But if you're going to use dearmament as an excuse to disempower somebody else while you keep your arms, that's not cool. And that should be obvious to anybody, who's watching. But if we're going to hold to it, and that's a big if, then I can see the benefit to it. If you're, the problem is that if this were happening in a time of sort of international accord, things are peaceful. I think there'd be a lot more merit to it, but I do see what you're saying.
And keep in mind,
probably the Trump administration is just going to use it as a cudgel.
Well, and Trump is pulling out these things. Like the moment that Trump didn't like it, he just pulled out. So think about that for the moment. It's like you sign on to a treaty, you think everything is great, and then bam, U.S. pulls out. Iran signs on to a treaty with the JCPOA, bam, Trump pulls out.
Yeah.
Basically, the United States has decided if we don't like it, we're just going to remove ourselves from it. So it's not even a consistency thing where you can even trust what we're doing on this stuff. I don't know. I'm not against. I'm all for bringing down hostilities around the world. By the same token, I do look at this stuff from the standpoint of what does a nation do when it's trying to maintain its sovereignty and its safety. And if I am a country that's growing, I don't believe for one moment that if the United States was growing and expanding, that it would make a deal that would curtail its expansion. I have a hard time believing that. Now, if China does that, fair enough. And if Russia and these guys come up to some kind of equitable deal with, okay, fair enough, we'll do this in order to alert each other in regards to the amount of missiles or cut down on the amount of missiles. Okay, fair enough. I think if I was China, I'd be against it. It's like North Korea. Should North Korea get rid of its nuclear weapons? No, not if you're North Korea. If you're the United States, you want it because you want these guys denuclearized so when you attack them, they don't have the capability of responding. It's the same reason you wanted Gaddafi to get rid of his weapons or any of the nations in the Middle East to not have weapons. You want to be able to strike them and them not to be able to hit you. And so the U.S. comes up with these excuses. I mean, it's just international politics and the way to do it. But if Russia and China are willing to sign on, fair enough.
That's the thing. We'll see what happens. I'm going to end headlines here real quick. You're listening right now to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. There we go. I heard that bam too, right on time. Yeah, no, I think you're right. That's the thing. It is largely an attempt to contain them. I think we could take a me first policy. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Okay, we'll pull our armaments back. We'll try to pull our troops away from the German border, et cetera. That's with Russia, of course, but there are various steps we can take to de-escalate on our end. I don't see us doing that. And I'll throw this in too. There's the idea of the deep state or the shadow government, this like continuity between administrations that rules over foreign policy. And I get that, and you can see that influence, but there's also this incoherent variation between each administration's policies. You go from Clinton to Bush to Obama to Trump. Each one's kind of stepping over the actions of the previous administration in various ways. And I think that's why. I mean, again, Obama signed the deal with Iran. Trump pulled out of that. I mean, again, there is this continuity, but there's also this weird unpredictability that, from other countries' perspectives, like you're saying, if they can't trust us to sign and hold to a treaty, that's lowering our standing. That's making it a lot less possible for us to have that lasting peace that I think we want.
Yeah. I think you're right. Yeah, I agree with you, Shane. Totally.
All right. We'll see. More disagreement. We'll see. We're going to come back in just a minute, though. We're taking calls next segment. 202-521-1320 is the number there if you want to call. We'll be back in just a minute. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Fault Lines. Want to talk? Get in touch with us at radio@sputniknews.com. Tune in to Loud and Clear with Brian Becker for the latest news, commentary, and political analysis. What's really behind the political and social crisis gripping the United States and the world? If you're tired of a superficial and shallow reporting for the mainstream media, here's your alternative. Forget the spoon-fed sound bites from pundits who know so little about so much. We deal with real issues. War in the Middle East, the military-industrial complex, U.S.-Russian relations, the rise of China, austerity, mass migration, global warming, and social justice movements in the United States and around the world, and much more. We bring you independent experts, analysts, and activists. Learn what really makes the decision makers take from the boardroom of Wall Street to the West Wing of the White House. Here is where the people fighting for chance speak and are heard loud and clear. 5 days a week on Radio Sputnik and SputnikNews.com. Fault Lines.
And we are back. Again, you're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We're taking calls this segment. You can call in 202-521-1320. That, again, is 202-521-1320. And we were just talking about nuclear armament, the New START treaty. I was thinking, what are they going to call this third START treaty?
Start 3. Start 3.
That's so simple. Yeah, I mean, and you're setting yourself up there. It's like you were a software engineer, right?
Yeah. I was a software engineer.
There's the whole versioning thing. You want to have those versions correct. So you got start 1, start 2, start 3. We're setting ourselves up for centuries of weirdly...
Start 1056. Right.
Exactly. Yeah, this weird conflict. Anyway, taking calls this segment. I thought we could talk about the Tulsa Trump event for a second.
Yeah.
This whole thing is weird and frustrating. On the one hand, I don't like Trump that much. On the other hand, I feel like a lot of people are making hay about this thing being underattended when it was apparently just, Dean's trolling. And while I'm opposed to the Trump administration, I can't really blame him for doing it. I also think he should be fair. And if that hadn't happened, he probably would have had many attendees. In other words, I don't think it's actually fair to say that this Trump event was a failure so much as it was bungled. It wasn't managed properly. Brad Parscale probably messed up. Whoever was in charge of handling those phony requests seems to have messed up. So you can look at it from that perspective. But from a sort of wider social perspective, I don't think that we can see this as evidence that Trump's base has died down. And I think that's what a lot of people are going to try to do with it.
No, it's not. No, absolutely not. Like, if you look at, I've seen 2 recent pollings on this, whereas the people who are voting for Trump, 70% love him. You had another one that says like 80% love him. The people who are voting for Joe Biden, in both, 30%. Everybody else for Biden was voting against Trump. So it's not, his base is still there. His base hasn't gone anywhere. I mean, I don't think this is evidence of that. I agree with you. What I do think, though, I agree with you that, yes, in real terms, whether it was a failure or not is, it's questionable just because of the interruption from the standpoint of the people on TikTok. So that's true. However, if the president of the United States, with all of the powers at his disposal, all of the cash at his disposal, throws an event, and in that event, he's screaming about 1 million people showing up at the event, I would imagine that event can't even hold 1 million people, let alone 1 million people showing up. But for him to say that and then to get 6,000, that's pretty funny.
Yeah, just from that optics perspective.
Right,
I'm not gonna,
right, just from the politics of optics.
Yeah.
Also,
that's
by the
abysmal.
way, 6 people, I don't know if we have the clip, or we could run the clip in this one. We were planning on playing it later. But 6 people of Trump's advance team ends up testing positive for COVID-19. Now, the reason why that is phenomenal is because there was all sorts of warnings where we kept telling Trump, you can't do this. That basically, oh, great, let's play the clip.
We have breaking news on the coronavirus pandemic as 6 members of President Trump's Tulsa advance team have tested positive for COVID-19. Trump campaign communications director said quarantine procedures were immediately implemented. Straight ahead, the latest in a legal standoff.
Now, if the advance team of the president is coming down with a COVID-19 crisis where they have to literally quarantine members of his team that's going out, I guess, get this set up, should he be having a rally like this? That's the question. I mean, Trump wanted to have this rally in order to show, yeah, we still got it. But the people who were there were like, whoa, this might not be a good idea on bringing all of these people together. And then at one point, Trump had to have these people, sign things saying that if you get ill, you can't necessarily blame us for getting ill. Maybe this was a poor time to have a rally. Maybe that's what it is. Because I think that a lot of these people didn't show up. They may love Trump, but they also may care about their health. I mean, you might get a 20% skew that says, yeah, I don't want to wear my mask. Yeah, those people exist. But you have even among the Republicans, a good chunk of them were like, yeah, I go Trump, but I need to wear my mask. So you still had a majority that saying, yes, I want to wear my mask, I want to be safe, etc. So those people might just not have wanted to put themselves at risk, even though 80% still back Trump. Like, I don't think it's a failure in terms of his base isn't there. I think it's one of those things of we're still in the middle of a pandemic. We have 120,000 people that died. We got 2 million people that died or that are ill. And then we have a massive number of people that are sick. We have a caller, actually. Let's go to Marcus Oh, I'm sorry, Ingrid from DC. Let's go to Ingrid first. Ingrid, how's it going? Wait, I can barely hear you, Ingrid. Try it one more time.
We can't hear you.
Okay,
yeah,
so
Ingrid,
let's
I'm
move
sorry.
to
Can you
Marcus.
please call, maybe just call back? Andre,
Yeah,
will check
try to
your
call
audio.
back, Ingrid. Let's go to Marcus. Marcus, what's going on?
Hi. I just wanted to remind everyone that when you elected president, you're only elected president for 4 years, and you have to, get reelected, and then you're out of there. So, I mean, as far as determining public policy, that's the people around him that are there for their entire lifetime. I mean, I really think that we have to just accept that fact. The president can't be accountable for 360 million people, individuals. But I have a problem delegating my own life. So I don't think it's reasonable to expect that President Trump would know every single issue, every single fact. You can't hold him accountable, and he is just a figurehead, and he's a cheerleader. But I want to mention, while we talk about politics, how are they elected? The Electoral College is confusing. Who selects the Electoral College? Who selects them? And then don't forget, we supposedly have a write-in ballot where you can write in whoever you want to be president, so that therefore you're not tied into this clearly, in my opinion, is fixed election cycle. But in the write-in ballot, can we please talk about the fact that every state has a different policy for how you write in a ballot, and some states, I think South Carolina, don't even have a section for you to write in who you want to be president. So I mean,
okay, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
Yeah, no, I'm just saying. So I think that it's time for revolution. Literally, use the radio to try to talk through all the deception and lies, and get to the point, which is that we're talking about figure cheerleaders, and really what it is the overall policy of the country, the overall, because, with this pandemic, for example, it's a pandemic. I mean, it's like the chicken or the egg. Which one comes first? I mean, everyone's running around talking about things, but we're not really, I don't think, really mentioning it. No one really knows, but it is an emergency. So is it the pandemic that's causing the emergency, or the emergency that's contributing to the pandemic?
Great question. Thanks, man. I appreciate it. Let's go to one more caller. Well, actually, we have two more callers. So let's go to DJ from Florida. DJ, what's going on?
Nothing. How you doing tomorrow?
How's it going? So what's on the agenda for today?
Well, there was a few things. One of the last caller, he made some great points. He kind of started touching on like a deep state conversation in regard to the 4 years that are served, and then why are these policies still, these longstanding policies, how are they affected, how are they supported? And you have people that they actually president, but that's just kind of a side tangent. I wanted to talk about China and their potential nuclear capability. If you don't recall, in 2011, they made this super big deal about getting a tanker. Now, we know that China definitely had tankers and they had all this equipment. Our U.S. military, well, I'm not going to say that. We know that they have more than what they're revealing, so that's an interesting conversation. But just now to decide, going about that rally that you both mentioned, I thought those were excellent points. I think it's interesting how China, they actually, that TikTok app, that's a Chinese app. You're not even allowed to use it on military base because of the way it acquisitions information from the app. It's funny that they're not using that as like some sort of excuse. They actually said they disavowed that claim that their rally was ruined by TikTok. And it's just funny when you talk about sorry, I wasn't super cogent. I enjoy you on whatever platform you're on, and yeah, I'm just listening.
Thanks, man. I appreciate the call. We have one more. Ingrid is back. Okay, so let's take Ingrid, and then we'll give an update on the Charlottesville case. Ingrid, welcome back to the show. Okay, I can't necessarily hear Ingrid, so let's give you guys an update. So our awesome producer, Rakeem, has given us an update. So according to Charlotte Mecklenburg police, officers responded to a report of a pedestrian being hit on Beatles Ford Road around 12:30 in the morning. When officers were on the way, multiple shots were fired. Medic was first to the scene, and witnesses say that's when shots rung out. A woman was pronounced dead at the scene after she was shot. At 6 a.m. Monday, officials confirmed 2 people were killed, 7 were shot, and 5 others were hit by cars during the incident. Witnesses said the chaos broke out what was supposed to be last night of Juneteenth celebrations. A video posted on Twitter showed the scene when an ambulance arrived and a reporter of someone being hit by a car. It was at this time that shots were fired, with more than 20 shots being heard on video. Wow. I heard about 60 or 70 shots. Sounded like people were running everywhere. Cars were leaving, one person said. I see. It's just sad someone took something that was an event that was supposed to be an event that turned into a massacre, a nightmare for families. People lost their loved ones. People out here in the streets dead. Charlotte's better than this. Apparently not, Shane. Apparently not.
No, yeah. Sadly, like you're saying, yeah, I noticed too that was a Juneteenth celebration, on Sunday night. So again, it begs a question: was there some connection there? Was this just random, or is there some other, specifically a racial motivation?
Especially with shots ringing out. I mean, that gets real weird, right? Like, usually, I mean, they're having a celebration, they're having a party, and apparently something happens, shots ring out, cops are called, ambulance are called, people are hit by cars. Now, the people are probably hit by cars fleeing from the shots. Because that's why I was like, why are the people hit by cars? There has been this propensity for right-wingers to basically ram into protesters. And so I wasn't sure if this was some kind of protest where people were being hit in that way. No, this sounds like people were basically trying to run and get away. And the car is basically just an unfortunate accident. Yeah, that's horrible. I mean, to put it mildly, that's horrible. We've been seeing this stuff. I mean, there was a story, 20 people were killed in 24 hours or something in Chicago. Look, when I look at the Black Lives Matter stuff, I think Black Lives Matter as a whole. And what I mean by that is, whether they're shot by cops, whether it's nursing homes, whether it's the 3-to-1 people are dying, across the board, I get bothered by all of that, including this, because I don't think we should turn a blind eye to this stuff as a society. These are things that we should deal with. But, that's kind of besides the point. This is one of those things of just kind of, that's horrible that this happened. But it's like, what do you do about it, right? It's like you have these small little emergencies that take place all across the United States. And you seem like impotent to really get your hands around it. And even things that your government should rationally be doing, either to cut down on the amount of commotion and drama and havoc in your society. You don't have a rational government that does those things. I mean, let's be honest. Black Lives Matter and all of these people were basically protesting, saying defund the police. What they're basically asking for is police kill 1,000 people a year. That's unfortunate. That shouldn't happen. Considering that in the UK, it's like 3. What are we doing that allow this? Now, I think that if you're focusing entirely on the police, you're missing the boat. Because honestly, part and parcel to this really does get to the notion of why are cops there. And so when I see the Chicago thing, I don't know about the Juneteenth thing. I don't know what happened in that situation. But I do know in many of these situations that a lot of this has to do with the trauma and the stress that we put people through that come out with really bad outcomes. I mean, that's just my take on it.
I hear you. I want to go. I just want to check real quick. We only have a minute or so left, but she's been hanging on. Ingrid, is there any chance? Are you still on? Is that working on your end?
She's back. She's going to be back at 9.
Okay, she's going to be back at 9. Andre's telling me now. I just wanted to make sure if we still had her, that we got to her before it got too late. I mean, with that, so you were talking about Chicago. It actually, within the last couple of weeks, has had its deadliest day ever in terms of the number of murders.
Yeah.
And the one thing that makes me think about is the cops. The cops pulled out. If you read the article, the police were saying. A local reverend was saying that the police weren't in the community. Again, I was bringing this up with Chris Hedges on Friday. I don't see what the wave of I can understand the wave of anti-police sentiment, but it seems like it's just going to hurt communities that, in some cases, just do need policing right now.
Let's have the conversation after the break.
For sure. All right, we're going to go into a break right now. We're going to be back in just a minute. We're also going to be talking with Tom Luongo from Gold, Goats, and Guns. Again, that's coming up in a minute here. Right now, that you're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Fault lines. We are above all the latest developments, and we don't take any sides. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Epidemics and pandemics could kill millions of people, and they actually did. Centuries ago, deadly outbreaks called the Black Death, the plague of Justinian, and the Spanish flu ravaged countries, empires, and whole continents. Some of these diseases are still present around the globe. Others have become a thing of the past. Discover how these ancient and not so distant outbreaks from previous centuries differ from modern-day SARS, MERS, and coronavirus pandemics. Listen to our new series, Outbreak, the deadliest epidemics in human history. This week on Radio Sputnik.
Fault lines.
And we are back. We're joined now by Tom Luongo. Real quick, though, you're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Tom Luongo, founder of Gold, Goats, and Guns, the Gold, Goats, and Guns newsletter. Former guest of the show until this whole thing happened. Don't need to get too deep into that, but I just want to welcome Tom back into the show. How are you doing this morning, Tom?
Good morning, Shane. Good morning, Jamal. How are you guys? Thanks. It's good to be back, and I'm doing fine.
Excellent.
Good to hear. All right, yeah, so you might have heard, if you've been on the last couple of minutes, you heard where that conversation was going at the end of the break there. Jamaro, though, I'd said some stuff. Maybe if you want to take it over and then pass it over to Tom.
Yeah, so, well, let me start this way. I tend to ask pretty much everybody since, we have a lot of stuff going on in the United States, to put it mildly. I'm curious, Tom, you focus a lot on the economic angle of the stuff. From your standpoint, what could Trump have done differently to handle this crisis? I know you look at this from a libertarian point of view. So I'm curious about how you see this stuff kind of materialize. Where is the United States going over the course? And this question breaks into two parts. What could Trump have done to improve the situation, meaning going forward in the United States with the COVID-19 thing and everything else? But on top of that, where do you think the U.S. is going economically, let's say, the next 4 months?
Okay. Yeah, that's a tough question. I don't know that Trump could have done things much differently given the political reality of the day. I think remember, Trump is a guy that will always at first bow to the advice he's given. He's done this with Pompeo. He's done it with Bolton. He's done it all throughout his presidency. But then when that policy fails, he immediately changes course, right? So, and he took the advice of Dr. Fauci's and Birx and all of that early on and advocated for the shutdown of the economy when information, even though it comes out now that he probably had the information this wasn't going to be as bad as it was being advertised, but politically that was, I guess, the right thing to do. Economically, it was not. So we're now dealing with the after effects of that, and I think that that's played into the size of the frustration that we've seen over the killing of George Floyd, right? I think that there's a certain level of, kind of psychological disturbance that happens when you lock people in their homes for a couple months. Because remember, economics is not just the study of money. It's absolutely the study of market psychology as much as anything else. So you have to always play that angle. And I'm going to talk in soft terms here, not in hard terms, because it's really hard to make that distinction. We can argue the merits of all this stuff, and everybody will have a nugget of truth in what they say. So
Tom,
there's
this
a
is
lot
going
of
to shock you, believe it or not. I think in part, you're right. I mean, I do agree with you that people being stuck in their houses, they get sick of being stuck in their houses. I mean, I disagree that a bulk of it is being stuck in the house, but I do agree that some of it. But I also agree with you that the economic hardship, meaning the government kind of took a position of, okay, we're going to give $1,200. Now, the $1,200 is just based on the research that's come out recently, did keep people relatively afloat, or the 600 from the unemployment thing. All of that ends next month, though. This is kind of where I'm going into this notion of, what do you think this goes?
Oh, I agree with you that there's a real problem when all this stuff, when all these emergency measures that they took in March and April end. And I think Trump's biggest political hurdle right now, given the size and scope of what I think is a color revolution that's being fomented around the country right now, and the hijacking of very real, honest to God outrage at police behavior in the United States, has been hijacked into something I think very, very dangerous. And I've written extensively about this. This is not a weird position for me. And I've been saying this really from the beginning. What I worry about now is that Trump absolutely needs to come up with some secondary effect, some secondary stimulus thing. And this is coming from a libertarian. I look at this.
I'm sitting here shocked that you're saying. I'm thoroughly shocked that you're saying this. Go ahead. I agree with you. Keep going. I don't agree with the color revolution stuff. We can talk about that, but I want to hear the stimulus thing. Because I think you're talking about the politics of it, right?
I'm talking about the politics of the situation. I'm talking about Trump's best chance of being reelected right now is to do another big stimulus package, which is what he's trying to get through the Senate. And McConnell is balking at this because McConnell actually doesn't want Trump reelected. And I'll be honest with you. You got to remember that nobody in Washington wants Trump reelected. They all want the apple cart to go back to, they all want the status quo to go back to where it was in 2016, where, the deep state was in control of everything. And, that's the scenario here. And you have to look through all of this stuff and see the actions of people behind this to understand what's happening here. I firmly believe this, and we can argue as to whether we're right or wrong, but that's fine. I'm going to say my position here ideologically, or at least not ideologically, but from a political perspective. And as a political strategist, I would be telling Trump right now to print money and spend money and keep the middle of America from completely imploding, because we're looking at housing delinquencies, mortgage delinquencies rise above 2008 levels probably by September. NPLs are already staring at about 8.5%. I think it was on Zero Hedge yesterday. Yeah. It'll be above 10% by September. Okay. So at some point, the banks are going to have to cry uncle. And I've talked about this previously in terms of we have to let the situation collapse. We have to let the banks and the lenders come together and refinance these loans and all that stuff. And I agree, but the economic dislocation from this is so large right now that, and the numbers that we're talking about are so ludicrous.
They're staggering.
That,
they really are.
Printing a few $100 billion to keep people afloat for another 3 or 4 months to get through the election. I don't see that as being a big deal. And then after the election, then you sit down and you start really looking at things. Because if you start to really dig into this, let me ask you a question, Jamal. What do you think the attack, the replacement of Jeffrey Berman as the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York was all about?
Well, if I'm Donald Trump, I don't want people. Let me say it this way: Donald Trump has spent the last 3 years with one ridiculous attack after the next, meaning, Trump in Russia, Trump in Syria, Trump in this, Trump in that. And so I would imagine if you're Trump, you have a very short temperament or short fuse for people basically investigating you. That's the way I took it. I mean, I don't necessarily know the entirety ins and outs of the case. I just know that this guy was investigating Trump, and Trump basically pushed him out. Now, tell me what I'm wrong on that, because again, I don't know the ins and outs of that particular case.
You're not wrong. That's kind of, I don't mean to be rude when I say this. That's kind of the 13-year-old's version of this.
Like I said, I don't know much about it, so I don't take it bad.
I mean that with the most respect I can, but I have to cut through the chase. The Southern District of New York is the most lawless place in the world next to Somalia, because nobody gets prosecuted of note in the Southern District of New York. That office is designed to protect Wall Street and the international NGOs, the people I call the Davos crowd, from any form of real reciprocity. At the end of the day, for the crimes that they commit, financial crimes, regime change crimes, and all the rest of it, it's absolutely the one thing that from the moment Trump was elected, I said, if he goes after the Southern District of New York, he's the real deal. Because that's where the swamp is the deepest. Okay? And so this will be the third U.S. attorney in the Southern District of New York in Trump's in Trump's presidency. Okay, and Berman refusing to step down and had being forced to be fired as opposed to stepping down means still a third time now that Trump is not, or second time now, Trump has been blocked from putting a person he wants in as U.S. Attorney in the Southern District of New York. Remember, Berman was in charge of the raid on Jeffrey Epstein's house. And from what I understand, we know nothing from that raid has made it out into the public. And then Jeffrey Epstein is mysteriously killed. Like, Berman's important here. Okay, and the Epstein thing is important, and how deep this rabbit hole goes. Because what I find really ironic is that everybody is like looking. I was watching the Twitterati yesterday on this. I wrote about this, and it's important because it ties into why I think electing Trump is still important, even though Trump is a buffoon and he's a failure and he's all of these things that I can talk about and like all these other issues. But for me, it is about finally breaking open some of these Gordian knots that exist and have existed for decades, going back to frickin' the fall of the Soviet Union, that exists within the Southern District of New York, okay? And to me, this is very, very important. And I think there's a lot of counter move that's happening here. And I don't expect him to clean up the FDNY anytime soon. But I do expect that, but I know that because he's willing to take it on, he's actually in a much more interesting place than it looks from the surface. And that's what I was trying to get at, and that's what I mean by this. The Southern District of New York is incredibly important. And anybody who any serious financial analyst and any serious political analyst understands why Wall Street got away with with minimal fines and nobody going to jail, and what sparked the Occupy Wall Street movement, which has morphed into Black Lives Matter and is actually what's out on the streets today. Part of the frustration everybody feels about this is because nobody was prosecuted in 2008 for their malfeasance, right? I'm not angry about it, and it all goes through the Southern District of New York, and it's all protected by people like Schumer and Nadler and any of the Republicans from New York and that region. It's all about that. It's about protecting Wall Street because that protects everything else. Okay, and that's why this is important, and that's why it's not the story the distraction is to say that he was investigating Trump for these things. Of course, he was investigating Trump for these things. That's the pushback against Trump trying to clean up the swamp.
Whoa, come on. You're trying to say that the only reason that they were investigating Trump is because he was trying to clean up the swamp. You realize Trump is not trying to clean up no swamp, right? I mean, let me explain to me what the swamp is, and explain to me how do you believe Trump is trying to clean it. We have 2 minutes.
Well, but I think you're just talking about it. SDNY is the case in point here.
Yeah.
Right, Tom?
Yes. It's massive. And look at what he's trying to do with unblocking Serbia and Kosovo. I was just reading about this. Well, he's trying. Look at all the things that John Bolton is talking about on his book tour now. All of the things. Rand Paul talked Trump out of making Bolton the Secretary of State. Yeah. That Bolton was angry with Trump for meeting with Putin, meeting with Kim Jong-un. These are all really big issues that Trump decided he wanted his presidency and was blocked by all of the D.C. swamp creatures from both sides of the fence.
That's true, but that's not the Southern District Court of New York, though. I mean, that's unless I'm wrong, but those are foreign policy actions that are just horrendous. I'm sorry, Trump was right on those issues, meaning Syria, be it North Korea, he was right. John Bolton is a maniac and a lunatic. So yeah, I agree with you, but that's not the Southern District Court of New York.
It's part of it. All these things are connected, Jamal. I mean, look, we used to talk about Browder a lot on the show. Do you realize that Browder is protected through that Browder's crimes from the 90s in Russia are still being protected by the Southern District of New York? Do you realize that?
We talked about that earlier in the show. We were talking about that exactly. Jeffrey Berman's predecessor, Preet Bharara, not only protected Browder in the Prevezon case, he also did an interview with Browder on his podcast, just again suggesting the degree of affiliation there. So yeah, we were talking about that earlier.
That's wild. Yeah, that's insane.
All these things are tied together. The malfeasance of Nuland and McCain on the Maidan in Ukraine, all of these things are connected. So much of this stuff goes through the Southern District of New York. Some of it goes through Hong Kong, which is why we're so against the extradition treaty and going into effect in Hong Kong, because the last thing anybody from U.S. intelligence or British intelligence, for that matter, want to see is for CIA plants at HSBC to be extradited to mainland China and waterboarded. Like, they don't want this stuff happening. They don't want any of this stuff to stop. They don't want They have built a very effective regulatory infrastructure to support all of these terrible things that we see in the headlines. This is what the empire does. It works at the bureaucratic and at the legal level. That's where the real swamp is, and it's incredibly difficult to break. Okay, because everybody is lined up to try and stop it. And they have layers of firewalls on this stuff.
Tom, let me bring you back to the break. We're joined by Tom DeLonge, geopolitical analyst and publisher of a Go Goats and Guns newsletter. We'll be back in a moment.
It's Luongo.
Luongo, I apologize. Luongo.
Feeling kind of blue, but maybe also kind of red, and kind of purple, and kind of alone? You've got a friend on Radio Sputnik. Tune in to Political Misfits from 12 to 2 Eastern Time, Monday through Friday, for news, politics, and culture without the two-party bias. Catch us daily on 105.5 in Washington, D.C., or 102.9 or 104.7 in Kansas City. Or find us on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you get your news.
Fault lines.
We are back with Tom Luongo, geopolitical analyst and publisher of Go Goats and Guns newsletter, and we have jumped into a really good conversation. Tom, you mentioned that what is taking place on the streets is a color revolution. It's funny. Half of what you say, I absolutely agree with you, and half of what you say, I don't entirely agree with you. Now, it depends on what it is, right? And I think the way you've described this, in part, I actually agree with you. So explain what you mean when you say it's a color revolution, but you made the point that it is to some degree based off of what took place from the standpoint of the financial crash and kind of the inability of the public to, A, to hold Wall Street accountable, but B, basically you had a housing market crash and now you have all of these other issues that are going on at the exact same time. Please explain what you mean by color revolution.
Okay, the color revolution thing is a well-worn conceit, a well-worn idea. We've used it in places like Ukraine, Egypt, Serbia, Georgia, yada, yada, yada. It's been done. We've seen it before, the purple revolution here, the violet revolution there, or orange revolution, the browns. Like, this has been going on for years. It's a regime change plan or operation that takes time to build. That takes time to build by infiltrating the institutions of culture, by subverting the younger generation, and then ultimately strangling the economy. We've tried this in Iran. It has not worked. We've tried it in Venezuela. It did not work. Mostly because, again, to Trump's credit, he wasn't willing to go the full 9 yards on it. So right. he'll try that. So that's part of this. And it only works if you can break down the institutions of culture and the economy at the same time. So let's look at what we have here. We have enforced social distancing and lockdowns on the people that are happening. This is all happening in the run-up to the re-election campaign for Donald Trump. At the same time, COVID-19, I firmly believe, was blown completely out of proportion in order to do as much economic damage as possible to exacerbate a financial crisis that was already in motion. Because honestly, it was Putin blowing up the oil markets on the weekend before the market started crashing. It was actually the catalyst for the markets to crash, and then all the COVID-19 restrictions came in to keep that ball rolling. The goal here is always to make the people as desperate as possible. And we talk about it, and we can talk about it in real time, but you have to see the bigger strategic picture. So you do all those things, and then I'm going to tell you what's really happened. Then from my perspective, when I look at how these protests have what look like real, honest to God protests, which they are, and which I would be happy to be a part of, but I understand that they'll be hijacked, which is why I don't go, is they are hijacked by people who are absolutely political agent provocateurs or paid for political provocateurs. Right. Tim Pool has covered this extensively regarding Antifa. Okay, have Tim Pool on the show. Have him explain Antifa's strategies to you. How he was there when they moved. They morphed the Trayvon Martin protests in New York City and turned it into Occupy Wall Street. He was there, dudes. This is documented. This is real. Okay, they understand how to manipulate crowds, how to create a false sense of of chaos. And we have that now. The whole push, in my mind, for getting rid of, for marginalizing, defunding, and delegitimizing and demoralizing the police in major cities around this country as a piece of policy by a lot of these mayors, I think is the next stage of this. Because what we're looking for is that moment where people started getting shot on the Maidan or in Egypt or wherever. And that's always the flashpoint for the storming of parliament, the takeover, the ousting of the president. That's what happened in the Yanukovych. Go look at the timeline of what happened in Kiev in 2014, and you'll see what I'm talking about. Pretty well documented that there were snipers on the rooftops, apparently shooting people from both sides in order to stir up chaos. When you create this kind of environment that we're in right now, it is not hard for people to hijack that easily.
I agree with you.
Take a lot of money, a lot of organization.
I agree that it can be hijacked. 1,000% agree. 1,000% agree with you. It can be hijacked. Whether that's by the Democratic Party, whether that's by, as you want to say, some other kind of like further to the left element that wants to pull it. But let's be clear for the moment. The conditions themselves weren't created by somebody pulling the strings. I mean, they were created by one crisis at a time that the United States just mishandled. I mean, the COVID-19 crisis, for example, perfect example. Before we came into the COVID-19 thing, 40% of the public lived off of $18,000 a year. And to your credit, when you make the point about the Wall Street stuff, you had the housing market that imploded with Obama just kind of watching it implode while he threw his body on Wall Street saying, I'm the one protecting between you and the pitchforks. Well, those were acts of policy by Democratic and Republican leaders who basically wanted to, like you said, protect Wall Street more than anything else. And now you have a situation where those people who had zero savings go into a situation where they are utterly destroyed. And like you said, I don't believe that this was... So both, right? I think a little bit of both is true. You have, 40% of the deaths from COVID-19 happen in nursing homes, like to 0.6 of the population. So I understand where you're coming from when you make the argument that it's blown out of proportion. But I disagree with the idea that it was done so intentionally with the idea that hurt Trump. I mean, there are events that happen that coincidentally do something just because of the event itself. And how Trump and how your society handled it makes the difference. I would agree with you that all sorts of problems are driving this. I would even agree with you that the original or the thing that's burning people is more economic. Especially when you get a huge number of people, white, black, gay, straight, etc., who are just flooding the market, flooding the streets, especially with the housing stuff that is coming up. But that doesn't necessarily have to be planned or intended. I mean, do you give any credence to that, or you accept that just all of this stuff is somehow orchestrated?
You can make the argument very, very, very succinctly that these things occur, right? These events occur, and then they go, oh, okay, well, we can use this opportunity.
Absolutely.
Don't let a crisis go to waste.
Yeah, you never let a crisis go to waste. Yeah, I agree.
Tomorrow, they've had them for years. I mean, look, when you've very successfully run color revolutions in 5 or 6 different countries around the world, and the irony here is that usually the United States is the one that's fomenting the color revolution. But what happens when that same apparatus is then utilized to? It's not just about Trump, okay? It's actually about us. It's about destroying any populist wave against what they've created here, okay? And if you look at if you look carefully at a strategic level, what they've been doing in EU, how they've hounded Boris Johnson in the UK, how they've hounded Trump here in the United States, but no one's talking about Lukashenko over in Belarus who didn't do anything, and they beat COVID-19 with no real incident. No one cares, right? I mean, honestly. So there's an angle on this that is purely political and purely about power. Okay. Purely about power. We're still dealing with it down here in Florida. Whenever I travel to Democratic counties in Florida, like Alachua or Broward, where I was recently, I have to wear a mask. Everywhere else, everybody's like, what, are you kidding me? Like, we got work to do. And you can just see it's become yet another thing to divide Americans along false ideological lines and keep us angry at each other and not pointing our fingers at actually who orchestrated this, even if it was just honest to God bad policy. Even if Fauci is not evil mustache twirling snidely whiplash, and he's actually incompetent, I'm not sure which one is worse. honestly, right? I mean, when you stop to think about it, because we just went through an exercise where, for the first time in human history, we quarantined the healthy, not the sick. And that doesn't make any sense. From a fundamental level, it makes no sense. So you got to ask yourself the question as to why. Because nothing in this world at this level happens just because. Right? But what does happen is that when they invite chaos like they have right now, with the level of unrest that they've fomented in the United States, chaos is chaos and it can't be controlled. I firmly believe that these people are trying to utilize this for their own political gain. But I don't know that they're competent enough, to be honest with you, to be able to ride the chaos and get to their planned outcome. That's where all of this breaks down.
I'm not sure about that either. That's the thing. You're talking about, I think, exactly the right thing there. Both the people who are engaged in the movement and any of the entities or individuals who are supporting it for their own their own ends. I don't think anybody here can predict how this is going to go.
That's true.
And you were talking about, again, this is a color revolution, State Department tactics being brought home. I wanted to do a kind of screeching turn here. We only have a couple of minutes left, but I was going to ask you some stuff, and it does relate to this in this wider financial perspective. I wanted to ask you about de-dollarization. We were talking earlier in the show about financialization, the increasing importance of financialization and financial industry, if you can call it that, in the world economy. Also talking about real wealth, quote unquote, real wealth, productive capacity, things like that. Also, Alex Craner brought up the endogenous growth model. He was talking about this sort of existential battle between these two competing visions of economic development in the world, where on the one hand you have endogenous growth, you're developing human capital, you're doing technological innovation, that kind of thing. And on the other hand, you have effectively one global center, which is feeding off of the rest of the world, which, I'm not going to say is 100% accurate, but that does remind me a lot of what the U.S. is doing here. Anyway, I wanted to get your take on this. De-dollarization to me seems pretty important as a sort of transition. It seems like an inevitable part of this transition away from the U.S. as this hegemonic entity. And I wanted to get your take on how that could work, and also why it's important, and also what we should be watching for if we wanted to know when different countries are moving to do this, what the implications of those moves would be, that whole cluster of issues. So anyway, it's a big sort of set of questions. What do you think about that, Tom?
I think all that's really good, and let me check the time. I have 4 minutes. I'm not sure I can do it in 4 minutes, but I'll try. De-dollarization is incredibly important, Shane. You bring up an important point, and this is one of my major criticisms about Donald Trump. The policies of sanctioning and tariffing the world, I've been saying since he started it, is only going to accelerate the process because you're making the dollar more expensive to use. Why is the dollar the world's reserve currency? Because it's cheap, it's effective, and we've never defaulted on our debt, right? Ever. Like in the history of the United States, we got rid of the Articles of Confederation and created the Constitution in order to not default on our Confederate debt. I mean, on the constitutional army debt, right? The Revolutionary War debt. Sorry. Okay, this is where we are in the world of financial capital. Like, we are the most trusted dirty shirt in the laundry, right? That at the end of the day. So Trump has been undermining that with his desire to try and hold on to the American empire overseas by using, because he's unwilling to use the military, to his credit, right? He's unwilling to really use the military in any dramatic fashion. He's willing to do economic warfare, and the economic warfare he's chosen is tariffs and sanctions, which raises the cost of using the dollar overseas, annoys people and angers people just as much, almost as much, as actually invading them, and he's accelerating the process away from it. So away from the dollar. The only thing propping up the dollar at this point is, one, that we've never, as I said, defaulted on our debt, and two, the fact that we're still biblically short dollars. There's still a lot of debt out there that has to be redenominated or defaulted on or retired. That's denominated in dollars, has to be paid back in dollars. And I was listening to a great podcast the other day with Grant Williams and Bill Fleckenstein and the Lord of the Dark Matter, who dismissed this argument and very quickly. And I'm like, no, you're missing the point. It's very important because you're missing the political angle on this, the geopolitical angle on this. And so it is incredibly important. The signs you want to look for every time somebody buys oil, creates an oil contract or tender and does it away from
1 minute.
Interesting. Tom, I want to respond to that real quick. We have less than a minute on air, but that, of course, that ties in the petrodollar. Yeah. The petrodollar, which I had thought of as almost something to speak of in the past tense, that I think shows the importance of it. Oil is still this hugely important. I mean, obviously, the world supply of energy is pretty much one-to-one dependent on oil. Very, very important. So again, I want to come back to that later. I also want to ask you at some later point about this idea of exporting inflation, which is linked to how the dollar works. Pretty sure you're familiar with that. Regardless, though, really enjoyed this segment. Sorry for cutting you off there, but very happy to be joined now by Tom Luongo. Great guest, geopolitical analyst, and publisher of the Gold Goats and Guns newsletter. Again, former frequent guest on the show, and hopefully we can have him on again soon. Great conversation. Looking forward to it. Regardless, we've got another hour of the best morning news show in America coming up. You have been listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Be right back.
Thanks, Tom.
Listening to Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Fault Lines.
And we are back. It's Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, the most disruptive show in American radio. I will come back to that in just a minute. In the independent corner, in the darkening corner where the candlelight barely shines, I am independent investigative journalist Shane Stranahan.
And I am the lefty in the darkness. One of those things that hang in the darkness. Unapologetic lefty, Jamal Thomas, in the left corner.
Again, you're listening to the most disruptive show, not only in American radio, but the Galaxy's radio and the Multiverse's radio too.
Multiverse.
Again, you're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
I like that, in the multiverse. Every reality known to the unknown and known. I love that.
All-encompassing. That's the thing. I'm just trying to think of the biggest possible spectrum of possibilities, and,
Yeah.
We'll see if there's anything larger. But anyway, headlines.
So let's jump into headlines. So we have SDNY, Southern District Court of New York, Attorney General Geoffrey Berman resigns. Now, Barr said that he was asked to resign. Jeffrey said he wasn't asked to resign. Then he actually resigned. Trump wrote a letter, although Trump said he wasn't involved. Oh, how weird, how strange. Somebody's lying. Guess who? We also have Ghislaine Maxwell apparently living in a Paris apartment. That woman needs to be behind bars. I've said that once. I will say it 1,000 times. If you lock up Jeffrey Epstein, then the logic for locking her up just kind of runs with itself. We also have an interesting meeting between Trump and Putin, who are holding for the New START Treaty. Now, this is going to take place later today in Vienna. And Trump is calling for Xi Jinping of China to be involved in this plan. We also have Charlotte attacks last night, where basically 2 people were killed, 12 were injured when shots were fired, having something to do with the block party. Cops were called. There were dozens of cops, dozens of ambulances, and apparently people were hit by cars. We think those cars were hit based on those people trying to get out of the way. We also have an interesting story from the standpoint of Trump's rally. Now, Trump was screaming that there were going to be 1 million people. Well, there ended up being far less, 6,000. Now, some of this had to do with kids getting involved, buying tickets en masse, were giving the wrong impression in regards to the number of people who were going to be at the rally. Now, Trump's people, Brad Parcell, said protesters blocked metal detectors and scared attendees away. Now, AOC explains what was most likely to be reality of it was basically Zoomers on TikTok signing up and artificially boosting the expected attendee count. Now, Parcell said that they weeded out phony requests. Clearly, they did not. These are your headlines. Okay, I thought that was... There we are.
There we go.
There we
you
are.
You gotta say Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Fault Lines
still
with
getting
Thomas and Stranahan. That's right. I have to get the buzzword right. I'm sorry. This is... we're new, clearly. And I haven't necessarily got all the buzzwords right, but we will be fixing that process.
We'll work it out. Work it out real quick here.
Go for it.
Yeah, no, totally. No, yeah, absolutely. Gone through the headlines now. I mean, here's the thing. We're talking, actually, we started talking with Tom Luongo about the color revolution stuff. I wish we'd gotten more into the de-dollarization thing. I don't mean to gripe about that.
The de-dollarization thing is interesting. We can get into it with Ben Swine. Ben Swine talks a lot about this also.
You're right. We're going to be talking to him about cryptocurrency, stuff like that. That'll be a pretty natural segue.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the de-dollarization stuff is interesting. And what's his name is absolutely right. Tom Luongo is 1,000% right. If you are Donald Trump and you are taking a position of saying, okay, I'm going to put sanctions on Huawei, I'm going to sanction Iran, I'm going to sanction even Europe. He even went so far as to say we're going to sanction Europe if they do X or Y. Well, what are those countries going to do? I mean, you're basically trespassing on those own countries' idea of sovereignty. Think of what the United States does for issues of sovereignty. We are pretty fanatical. I mean, we were willing to go to a nuclear war for missiles in Cuba. So our issues and threats to our sovereignty, whether it's foreign, whether it's domestic or whether it's military, meaning economic or military, matters. So why wouldn't it matter to other countries if we're saying we're going to sanction you for doing something that is entirely a domestic issue? It's so weird. And those countries naturally, conceptually, decide we need to have a different currency. Why wouldn't they say that? I mean, look at what the U.S. did in regards to using its muscle to go after Iran. Well, every other European nation was against it. And yet the U.S. did it, and Europe couldn't do anything about it, despite all of those guys being signatories to the treaty of the JCPOA. So it's like those countries care about their sovereignty, and Trump taking these extravagant actions, well, it makes it the cost of using a dollar that much higher politically and economically. And those countries, rightfully so, like China, are talking about dropping the dollar. Why wouldn't they?
That's the thing. It seems like an inevitable byproduct of that system. I mean, the other side of this is the Triffin dilemma. I think we've talked about this before. The Triffin paradox, it's also called. Just when you have this artificial boost to the value of the USD, you get lowered incentives for manufacturing and trading, basically.
Yes.
And I think that, along with the outsourcing thing, I mean, again, if you look back at the Nixon shock, that's when this whole thing started. That's really right then, at that moment. From then on, deindustrialization began.
When Nixon created the fiat currency, where Nixon basically said, screw it, we're no longer tethered to gold.
Exactly. And this had followed the Bretton Woods Conference. It's a part of a history, and it's a kind of complicated history, but in some ways it also kind of isn't. You can break it down. After that point, we switched over to a fiat currency. It was basically untethered in some sense. It was floating exchange rates. And since then, because the USD has been the world's reserve currency for the most part, its primary reserve currency, it's boosted its value artificially. That means that U.S. goods are going to be more expensive, which means that we're disincentivized from producing goods. So all these conversations about financialization or over-financialization, I think a lot of it does go back to that decision and are continuing in that vein. In a weird way, people will talk about the welfare state. We're kind of living off the largesse of all these other countries. You know what I mean?
Oh, literally. Literally.
That's the thing.
Think about when the UK no longer was, when the pound stopped being a reserve currency. Well, their economy shrunk. It had to. Like when the dollar is a reserve currency, we are allowed to do stuff that other countries can't do. For that very specific reason of being the reserve currency. Our dollar is at this point indispensable. The moment that dollar stopped being indispensable, all of that debt and all of that other stuff, our ability to, have all of this, like you said, largesse around the world shrills up. It's just, we can't keep it up. But the catch becomes the United States is going to fight like cats and dogs to maintain that dollar as the natural currency.
Yeah, no, because we're used to living off it. That's the thing. Yeah. And I'm going to take it actually just for a second, take it a little bit philosophical or psychological. I think there's this element where if your economy is dominated by abstract wealth, again, financial wealth, where what you're betting on effectively are futures of futures of futures in a lot of cases, derivatives, more and more complicated, hierarchical arrangements of dependencies of these things. It's so abstract. And I think you can, I don't know, again, this is philosophical, but if I look at our society, I'm just worried that we're not practical and pragmatic enough. I'm worried that the way that we've come to think over the past 40, 50, 60 years has gotten more ideological, more unhinged, less concrete, less practical. And I think that there is a connection there. What do you think about that, Jamal?
I do agree with have we gotten more ideological? That's interesting. I don't know if it's like ideology. Anywhere you are is where you're at, right? I don't know if we have more so. I do agree with you that from a capitalistic standpoint, we take certain actions that preserve or that set cash above human life. That is an ideological position like nobody's business. And people tend to think that it's not. People think it's a rational position. It's not a rational position. It's not rational or otherwise. It depends on what you think and you prioritize. Value is not one of those things that's an absolute. Some people care for their kids. Some people care for their dogs. Some people care for cash. Some people care for their relatives. But in our case, as human beings, you would think that we would prioritize human beings as the highest form of thing, but we don't. We prioritize, and oftentimes cash, like the nursing home case. We got to make cash, so we're going to throw these people out on the streets. We got to make cash, so we're going to sell this medication at the highest rate that we can sell it. But just be aware, that's not forced. Your society chooses that because there are certain elements of your society that profit off of that. That's not natural. That's just a system that you're functioning in that has set those things as the highest of priorities. When you're talking about the financialization and everything else, I think it's a natural outcome of not necessarily the de-dollarization. I think it's a natural outcome of people trying to figure out ways to maximize their profit. And they found this way in the financial market of saying, hey, we can bet on bets on bets on bets. And we can put this stuff out. Nobody knows what this is, and we'll, make a ton of cash off of it. I don't entirely think it's fiat currency. And maybe I'm wrong. Maybe fiat currency kind of just added or made that process that much worse.
Well, yeah, here's the link I'd say. If you de-incentivize trade, if you de-incentivize exports, where are you going to put your money? And then the question becomes, okay, if this area of commerce, and not commerce, pardon me, if manufacturing is less profitable, then the people who are very wealthy and have lots of money that they want to make more money on are looking for places to put it. And the financial industry becomes that place.
Yes, that's true. And I agree with that.
That's the thing. And I think that's really, those are some of the follow-on effects from the Nixon shock.
I think your argument
again,
is
on
that
that deeper
the money,
level, incentive-wise, I think it makes sense. Go ahead.
I think you're saying that basically with fiat currency, it's a disconnection from any notion of cash and this kind of immaterial value of cash to real things. And so since it's not really connected to gold or anything else, well, you can have as much of it as you want. Like you can basically print $20 trillion if you want it, because it's untethered in real terms. With the fiat currency thing. So what they ended up doing was, we have all of this cash, what are we going to do with it? Let's just bet on the financial market. That's the easiest way to do it. I think that's where you're going with it. I think I agree with that. I think part of that, though, is that as your country decides, okay, we need to make more wealth, it starts looking for ways, like you said, to put that money. But it also puts that money abroad. If it becomes cheaper, just by definition, if it becomes cheaper to build a product in China, you build a product in China. The problem with building that product in China, though, is, of course, you get rid of a job. In the United States, you get rid of multiple jobs. You sell a product for $3. You import that product for free because you've created trade deals that would allow that to take place. And companies make tons of cash, where the guy who's making $20 an hour is now working at Walmart, barely making minimum wage if he's lucky. Making minimum wage if he's lucky. So I agree with you, but I think it's a little bit more than just the financialization. I think the financialization was just kind of a natural outgrowth of what was already there. I don't think it was something dramatically new. I could be wrong. I agree with you that the Breckin Woods agreement, all of that stuff broke down. I agree with you with the Nixon stuff and the tariffs. I agree that it was a new day and looking at how our world faced, but we didn't necessarily change our habits around it. I mean, we should get Stephanie Kelton on and talk about the kind of this new reality of the fiat currency. But I don't necessarily think it's inherently bad. I think that's where it sounds like you're going with this, like it was an inherently bad process. Cash isn't real. Whether it's backed by gold, whether it's backed by anything, it's not real. You can have it backed by tulips for all that matters. The catch becomes, what are the real resources in your society? And what is the trick? What is the thing that you convince people, or the method that you convince people to go and use those resources in order to build other things? I don't necessarily think the fiat currency, one way or the other, is good or bad inherently. I think how your society is organized and what its priorities are is the thing that matters more than anything else. You could have a fiat currency, and you can have people say, hey, our priority is make sure people have healthcare, and that fiat currency goes towards healthcare. We just make a choice for something else.
We'll talk about it. We'll talk about it on the other side of the break. We're coming back in just a minute here. Again, we're going to be taking calls next segment. 202-521-1320 is the number to call. We are Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Fault Lines. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, we give you the most essential information out there. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold. Catch all the breaking global political and economic news as it happens. Sputnik brings an all-star lineup with expert opinion from some of the biggest names in the news today. Noam Chomsky.
Turkey, U.S. ally, their main goal is to attack the Kurds, the one ground force opposing ISIS. There have been a kind of a funnel for support of ISIS, not officially, but in practice.
Peter Sunde, co-founder of the Pirate Bay.
We don't have any sort of democratic control over the internet. And I think that we're very naive when we think that the internet itself is intrinsically good. It's not. It's just a very neutral technology that is being used for good things, but more and more being used for evil things.
Icelandic Foreign Minister Gunnar Bragi Sveinsson.
Increased activities in the Keflavik airbase, and that has to do with more activities from the Russian Northern Fleet in the ocean around Iceland, and also, of course, these usual flights of the bombers.
Robert F. Kennedy Jr.
We're the ones that destroyed the government of Libya. We're the ones that put in a pipeline dispute that helped destroy the government of Bashar al-Assad in Syria. We're the ones who invaded Iraq.
Former U.S. Secretary of Defense William Perry.
The hostile relationship between the United States and Russia today is dangerous for both countries, not because either country would actually want to start a military conflict, but because there's always a danger of blundering.
Sputnik talks to the brightest minds in politics and current affairs to find out what's really happening. Tune in. Fault Lines.
And we are back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We're taking calls this segment. We already have a caller on the line, but if you want to call in, you can have the number. Here it is, 202-521-1320. Again, that's 202-521-1320. But right now, we have somebody. We're talking about something tomorrow. I want to make sure we get Daniel's perspective, though. Maybe we can come back to it after. Daniel from Texas. Daniel, you're on. What's on your mind?
Well, before I go into what you guys were talking about, economics and monetary theory, my comment is, you mean that Trump campaign rally was as sparse as a Hillary Clinton campaign rally?
It was. It was. Yeah, there was 200 people in it, and Trump was like kind of bringing everybody together to take pictures like it was larger. No, not so much. The funniest thing in the world was when they were the overflow section. Oh, it was so sad. It was so sad because implicit in overflow section is overflow, and the very thing that he had none of. I just think it's awesome.
Regardless how it happened, not really that. You guys were talking about monetary theory in a way of the fiat currency, and I think you guys should look up Mark Blythe.
Yes.
And there was named the guest that was on yesterday on the Hill, the Rising show, on their weekend edition, but they were talking about that. And it's not so much how much money is in circulation, because you can look to Japan, but it is in the real resources you have available.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, because our finance system is done by computers now, and I forgot this book that talks about this kid that got arrested in Britain in 2015 for basically sticking it to the systems. But monetary, all money is basically worthless at some level. And when you understand that, printing and not printing it will have eventually an inflationary problem with it, but it's based on how many people value it.
Well, resources. It's based on real resources. I think you're talking about like Stephanie Kelton. Basically, I think, thank you for the call, man. I think basically the point that they're trying to get at is, or Kelton gets at, is that how much resources you have is the thing that matters. That the money itself isn't really real. I mean, these guys are just printing whatever. But basically, how much stuff do you have? So say, for example, you say, I'm going to have every person who wants to go to school. Well, you may need more books. You may need more desks and shelves. You may get inflation just from having to put money into those things, because those things that don't necessarily exist, and you've created a shortage of those items. By the same token, if you have enough schools, then you're saying everybody's going to go to school is not necessarily going to have an inflationary effect on those items. It really does depend on your real resources. That's the point that they make with monetary theory, that the money isn't real, the resources are.
One of the things with fiat currencies, though, is it kind of gives governments the ability, and in some cases, I mean, I'd argue, because it gives them the ability, it gives them the incentive to pretty easily hide their inflation, to do the inflation thing by printing more money, but to obscure it just, by mixing the books in various ways. I mean, the Fed has given increasingly less information as time has gone on. First, it was the M3 stuff that got cut off, the M2 bonds, and then it seems like the M1. Anyway, I think that's part of it. I mean, people would always debase currencies. That's quite difficult to do, though. But with quantitative easing, again, it's as easy as putting out a Fed press release and turning on the printers, as far as I can tell.
Yeah.
So I think that's where a lot of that problem comes in. I think you're right that if you're going to measure, call it wealth. This is a pretty classic distinction: wealth versus money. Wealth being real, money being the virtual representation, attempted representation of wealth. Like you're saying, you want your picture of your economy to be tied to how well that economy is actually doing, which has to do with the material resources, the material interchange, along with all these social institutions and governmental institutions and stuff. That's tied into the economy too. But you really want an accurate picture of what your country is producing, what people are consuming, all that stuff, because that gives you a picture of how well people are doing. And I think that's part of it. The point that I'm making, again, I'd like to get people who are a little bit more qualified on this, because I'm just sort of itching around these issues. But that point I'm making is, I think fiat currency gives countries the incentive to play those kinds of games. And I think that game is inherently bad for the countries in the long run.
I see. And so, yeah, I see. I think, I do think it creates an incentive. And to be fair, we do it with the military. I mean, we have, $4 trillion in debt, if I'm not mistaken. And, it's like, but what do we get for that? And I think people would be hard pressed to find it. I mean, like, if you were, I had a friend of mine where I asked him, he's a right winger, and I said, if we were 20 trillion in debt and your kids could go to school for free, you had Medicare for all, meaning everybody had health care, and you had a situation where when people got older, they basically were taken care of, would you have any issues? Like, no. His issue basically boiled down to this idea that he felt like he was the only one looking out for himself. And that if that was the case, then he would vote Republican, because at the very least, Republicans are very clear that they don't care about you, whereas Democrats basically lie and pretend that they do. And so it's like this weird situation where it's like, all right, so it's not that you are unempathetic. It's more like it's this weird thing of like trying to understand where he's coming from in the logic. But I don't know what we got for that. Like we're throwing people out of nursing homes. So it's like, what actually did we get for the cash? And this goes back to Tom Luongo's point, right? Like, that people are angry about that. Like, whether people can put it into words, whether they can articulate it in those terms where they say, look, we are X amount of money in debt, we have 40 million people out of a job, we have 120,000. Whether people articulate in those very specific terms or not, it's almost irrelevant to the fact that those people recognize something is wrong, even if they just feel it. And I suspect that a lot of those people who are Bernies or burners, and Bernie Sanders said, do you want to fight for somebody like you're willing to fight for yourself? Those people said yes. But I strongly think Tom is right. Like, it's this economic malaise, it's the health thing, it's the being in your house for all the time. It's like all of these crises are hitting at once. And then we're going to have the secondary crisis of the housing. And then we're going to have the other crisis of people not, like the $600 going away. I'll tell you this, if you have a libertarian that is on fault lines who is telling you that you need to give some kind of extra financial assistance from the government, A, that's mind-blowing, and B, you probably better take him seriously.
Yeah, that's something to pay attention to.
Yeah,
that's exactly right.
That's mind-blowing to hear Tom say that. He's right, but it was mind-blowing to hear him say it.
We have a few more callers. I want to get to them. So we have James from Virginia. James, you're on the air. What's on your mind?
Good morning, gentlemen. I got a couple of quick points. Earlier, you guys stated about that the Trump rally was really insignificant. I mean, the crowd. But what was more relevant to me was that an hour before the rally, he was supposed to speak at the overflow, to an overflow crowd outside. And there were 25 people there. So that had nothing to do with TikTok or anything else. All right. So secondly, what Tom Lugo was wrong in many cases. I mean, first and foremost, the United States has defaulted on the national debt twice. In 1933, when we got rid of the gold clause, and the Congress allowed the government to decide how it would pay and the value of what it would pay for debt. And in 1979, we had a temporary debt. It was about $120 million, but it ended up costing us $6.6 billion to rectify a $120 million error. So we defaulted by $120 million. And finally, what Tom was saying about the district court in New York, I mean, the district courts and AGs all throughout this country have failed to hold corporations liable or responsible for their inactions. Yeah. There's no major fracking or oil spillage lawsuits. Nobody's gone to jail for any of those. So to say that, they're propping up Wall Street. Well, Wall Street is in Texas and Oklahoma and every place else. And under no circumstances anybody being held accountable. That's right. So it's not just a Democrat or liberal thing. And Tom did slip up and actually say Democrat, but he kind of took it back and said when he was referring to who they were protecting. But that's for another day.
Well, to be fair, I mean, he is a libertarian. So he is going to have a certain point of view on those things. But no, dude, I really appreciate it. I agree with you with the Southern District Court of New York stuff. That's why I pushed back, was like, why do you think that, this court is uniquely responsible? But I agree with you. We don't, those things seem to be endemic to the United States, where we just, those people aren't held responsible. Like, I can go and I can vote, I can get Pepsi or Coke. I can get a Reese's Peanut Butter Cup or Zingers. But I don't necessarily have a choice in saying, I don't want my government dropping billions into oil and gas, or I don't want my government protecting Wall Street. There's no person to vote for that does that, because both parties functionally agree on those things. And so it's like when Obama said, I'm protecting Wall Street, or I'm holding, I'm the one that's standing against you. Well, that's a Democratic president doing it, but any of the presidents would have most likely have done it. So I agree with the caller on this. What do you think, Shane?
I agree too. Interesting call. I want to give Tom the benefit of the doubt on this stuff, because I think he was making a lot of good points. Yeah. Maybe if you want to call in next time, that'd be great. Actually, I'm a little bit distracted here because I'm just thinking about Ingrid from DC, who's on the line, who'd called in at 8:15, and we didn't get to, sadly, due to some audio glitches. Regardless, Ingrid from DC, you're on the air. How are you doing this morning, Ingrid?
Can you hear me now? Is the third time a charm?
Success.
Yes, it is.
What's going on, Ingrid?
Oh, so much. You have covered so many topics, and thank God you got back to the signature issue, Shane, with Bill Browder. Tom did make some misstatements, but the reason he's so focused on Southern District of New York, every court has a jurisdiction, and of course Wall Street is in that jurisdiction, so he's most familiar with that. The Berman firing, I heard on one of the talk shows today, well, they're going after Giuliani with this case, Berman was, and they referred to it as Giuliani having been fed misinformation by Ukraine, who had been fed misinformation by Russia. So it's, Russiagate 3.0 going on there in New York. I hope you're going to get to that. One thing you didn't cover, you didn't mention the Reverend Barber and the People's Poor campaign that was this weekend. This was a virtual
rally,
which apparently he had 1.5 million viewers of that. I was not one, so I can't comment on the whole thing, but I will say he gave the closing remarks, which were magnificent. I mean, he's just right in the line of MLK, yes, he is. And he brought in war and everything else. And it actually, in all of this chaos, he seems like someone who might be able to pull a thread of hope out of it in a good direction, because right now it's all over the place. Another thing, Tom, I'm just going to mention Belarus because nobody else will. Tom is absolutely incorrect when he says that Belarus did nothing. Belarus did a lot. They just didn't happen to do the same things everybody's talking about. But they have a huge tracing system. They have much more beds capacity in case anybody got sick than here. So if people were ill, they wouldn't have this kind of bottleneck in the emergency that we have here. And they did issue precautions for elderly people. And Belarusians are different people than we are. They're not running hither and thither with this liberty, we got to go shopping business. I'm sure they took it seriously and went about their business.
Yeah. No, thank you, Ingrid. I appreciate it. Yeah, look, Tom has he has a particular idea of the stuff that he doesn't necessarily believe that we should have had the shutdown. Meaning shutting down the economy. I profusely disagree. And to put it mildly, him and I have had those back and forths on Political Misfits about it. But that he does believe it. I don't know the entire case of Belarus. That's why I didn't necessarily give a response to Belarus. But thank you for responding, Ingrid. I appreciate it. Shane? Belarus
earlier on, we're going to go into a break in just a second here, but Belarus earlier on had been known as one of these countries that wasn't doing as much. But like Ingrid was saying, I've heard that that's not true. I want to get more on that. Yeah. Regardless, we're going to go into a break right now. Ingrid, thank you so much for calling in, friend of the show. And we'll be right back. Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Fault lines. Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Shooting from the left.
We're taking no prisoners here. Real opinions for real people. Where we bring you people with controversial views, and instead of trying to catch them out, we actually let them expand on their views. What's going on in British politics, European politics, and indeed in world politics as well. And wherever you are, whether you're a UKIP supporter, a Tory or Labour, everything is in turmoil.
John Gaunt.
Shooting from the lip.
Fault Lines.
And we are back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We are joined now by Ben Swan. Ben Swan is an award-winning television news anchor, investigative journalist, and a host on the program Boom Bust. That's airing weekdays on RT America. You can follow Ben on Twitter at Ben Swan. It's 2 N's, by the way. Regardless, though, we're joined by Ben Swan this morning. How are you doing, Ben?
Doing great. Thanks for having me on.
Hey, thanks for joining us. Yes, we're having you on to talk about some economic stuff today. We're going to be talking about Google demonetizing right-leaning websites. It's an economic thing, I'd say. And then we're going to be talking about cryptocurrencies. We're also talking earlier in the show about de-dollarization, something I've heard you've been talking about and researching for a little while. So that's the sort of slate of topics. But for this first segment, we're going to be talking again about Google demonetizing right-leaning websites. So this is something I've heard about for months, as anybody has. I've heard Google demonetizing right-leaning websites, and of course, people on the left have been talking about Google suppressing leftist voices. Yeah. It seems like, though, there's something new going on in the last month. You've been seeing some stuff. Can you tell us what this story is about, what you've been seeing?
Yeah, what's really interesting about this story in particular, you're right, this has been going on for some time, where Google has either demonetized or outright deplatformed certain voices. What I would say is that Google, you have to look at Google as multiple entities. Obviously, you have YouTube, which is a content creation entity. You have Google as a search engine, which allows people to be able to find websites and articles. And then you have Google Ads, which really controls, along with Facebook, about 80 to 85% of the entire online ad revenue market. And so Google holds a massive monopoly in terms of that space. If you are a website that's trying to, put ads on your site, only way to do it anymore is to do it through Google Ads. Facebook does do some ads, but those are all within their space. Google does it on your own website. So what's significant about that is this latest kind of turn in this story came last week when NBC News reported that 2 websites, one is Zero Hedge, the other one is The Federalist, both have been flagged by research that, by the way, NBC News was doing along with a group out of the UK that essentially is like a group that tries to monitor hate speech.
And essentially, they said they flagged these two sites, Zero Hedge and The Federalist, as having hate speech content on their sites. The problem is, number one, Google didn't even contact either of these sites. They both found out when they saw a tweet from NBC News that tagged them saying that they had been demonetized. Turns out they hadn't been. They were given a warning after they then contacted Google, and Google said, you can take away the offending content. Here's the problem, and the really surprising part about this. The offending content was not content written by any journalist working at either of these organizations or an editor. It was not posted by the website itself. These were comments in the comment section on articles because readers had made comments that were deemed as being insensitive or had racial overtones or even racist. The websites were going to be demonetized because commenters had said things about the articles. So in these two cases, Zero Hedge refused to remove comments and they were demonetized. The Federalist agreed to go ahead and remove the comment section. They no longer have a comment section, though they have said they will bring it back when they can. But right now they're complying so they can continue to work with Google Ads.
That's amazing. I mean, I know left-leaning sites were complaining about this also, where there was, like, for example, my site, it's censorship. I mean, basically, Google deplatform sites they don't particularly like, or raise up things like CNN and whatnot online when people are going online for independent sources. Also, you know, this is also taking place from the standpoint of Palestinian sites or sites that were dealing with things like Telesur. I remember they took Telesur down. So this has been happening somewhat across the board. What do you think is the reason for this new push of censorship, meaning this notion of suppressing these ideas, especially as we, you know, go forward through these various crises?
Well, I think it's part of a larger strategy. And so what we're seeing right now is kind of the latest chapter in that. And I think there's been a real effort to do a couple of different things. One has been really for the past 4 to 5 years, we've seen, as you just said, a real clamping down on speech through tech companies. And that speech, you know, what people wrongly say about it is that it's only one side. It's not. You're correct when you say, you know, it's happening on the right and it's happening on the left. And it's happening mostly to independent voices. If you are an independent journalist or an independent voice or an independent opinion online, you're getting crushed. What's happening is dissent is being crushed, and instead the focus is on really propping up establishment media. Establishment media is allowed to survive. So what you don't see, for instance, on the right-left debate is an entity like Fox News is not going to get crushed by Google Ads because Fox, despite how they position themselves, is an establishment voice that echoes a lot of establishment talking points. Same thing on the left, CNN or MSNBC. NBC News itself will never be crushed under this weight. So what we're seeing is kind of a prolonged campaign of we're going to limit reach. We're going to limit the ability for people to find you in the first place. And so once you really become kind of narrowed down where you have very little readership, very little viewership, very few people are even able to find or access your site because you've been buried in search results, or on Twitter and Facebook, you can no longer even be seen because you're being buried into people's feeds. Once that happens, now the next step to kind of choke you out the rest of the way is to cut off your ad funding and to find an offense that you've committed that violates terms of service so that your ad dollars can be taken away from you. And the crazy thing about this, again, is that neither of these sites did anything on their site that is punishable. Instead, this is an act by a commenter. And what's really ironic about this is this whole debate that's going on where President Trump just signed this executive order basically saying Section 230 protections from the Communication Decency Act should not be extended to tech companies that are acting as publishers instead of platforms. Google argues that it is a platform and it's not a publisher, therefore it's not making editorial decisions. And what's really incredible, though, is that under that same kind of thinking, Google should be able to say, hey, we recognize that you as a publisher, in the Federalist or Zero Hedge, should not be held responsible for what a commenter says on your site, because that's exactly the protection that the federal government has given Google, where Google itself is not liable for what a commenter or a poster or a website puts up through Google. Google cannot be sued because there is a legal protection in place to protect them.
I want to come back to Section 230 in a second, because that is, I think, extremely relevant to what we're talking about now. I also just want to briefly comment, though. George Galloway and Katie Hopkins were apparently both targeted by the group in the UK that you were talking about earlier. So Katie Hopkins, actually a guest on the show we've had on a few times. She was permanently banned from Twitter, but George Galloway, again, on RT, has been gone after too.
RT on Gray Zone also, just to interject for a moment. Gray Zone, same thing. I mean, on Wikipedia, apparently they got rid of Gray Zone.
Oh, man. So Section 230, you just started talking about that. That's an interesting ruling. Again, this a lot was being made of this about a month ago. And like you were saying, it's this shift from viewing social media companies from basically being a publisher to, like you're saying, something like a platform where they're having to, the onus is on them to editorialize. That seems to be the general shift there. It leads me to ask the question, how is that going to look in the long run? I mean, these tech companies are saying that with Trump trying to change their ruling, they're going to be more susceptible. But it seems like what they've been doing is exactly the editorialization that we've been trying to get them to not do. I mean,
exactly.
Before this thing happened, before Trump came out with this, what were they doing? Their policy was they would have terms and conditions. Those terms and conditions would include something like inciting violence or hate speech, and then they would use that as an umbrella to selectively suppress different voices. It seems like they're using this weird loophole in the old system, but it seems like they're going to have to face the music if they want to apply that in the new system. What did I get wrong there, and what's your take on where this is going to go, Ben?
Well, yeah, so essentially the way that Section 230 is set up is it gives a tech company the ability to survive without being hit by lawsuits every other day because someone who's using your platform, i.e., on YouTube, a content creator who uploads clips from a movie. Well, now you've committed intellectual property theft because you showed clips from a movie you didn't have the rights to. Well, if that happens, the movie company can't turn around and sue Google or YouTube and say, hey, it's on your platform, therefore you have harmed me. Section 230 holds Google harmless, saying, no, they're a platform, not a publisher. So they don't make editorial decisions, and it gives them this protection to exist. That's why tech companies have been able to grow to the size that they are, is because of this particular law. But if you remove that section, two things happen. One is you would strip away the protections from Google and Twitter and Facebook in order to kind of even the playing field. But the danger in it is if Google and Facebook and Twitter continue to not abide by this and no one holds them accountable for it, by removing Section 230 protections, the only thing you're really doing is you're now preventing competition because smaller, weaker companies that are coming up and trying to grow, startup companies, will be treated as if they don't have this protection, and therefore they can be subject to lawsuits and attacks. And that will happen, by the way. I guarantee you that if you have companies that don't have this protection, there will never be competition for these tech behemoths because they won't be able to grow to the size where they have the revenue to fight it. Right now, Facebook and Google can fight anything that comes against them because they have tens of billions of dollars rolling through their companies on any given day. So they can fight all of this, whereas the startups cannot. So we have to be very careful about removing Section 230 as a one-size-fits-all. What you need to do is you need to set up a specific entity, government entity, that monitors whether or not platforms are acting as a platform or a publisher, and then make that decision based upon punishing those who violate it. I would not remove Section 230. I would hold companies accountable to being accountable to the language of it in order to be a Section 230 protected entity. But removing Section 230 will ultimately destroy competition.
Ben,
that's a great take. Go ahead, Jamal.
No, I was just going to take a break. We have about a minute left before we go into the next break. Ben, I want you to think about what do we do about this? Basically, we've lost our commons. And in losing our commons, our corporate capitalist giants are basically in charge of our speech. How do we fix that? We've basically slid into this particular reality. We have about a minute left if you want to answer that here, or we could take a break and you could answer it on the backside.
I'll just say very quickly that the fight against comment sections demonstrates where this battle is going. As a web company, you are being told you are not allowed to have viewers or readers who dissent from the prevailing narrative. And if you do, you either shut them up or you will not be allowed to be monetized. And so you are actually arming all these websites in a way that says either you clamp down on speech on your site or you will fail to exist.
That is terrifying. I mean, honestly, that is utterly and entirely terrifying. We're going to take a break in a moment. We have Ben Swann. This is award-winning television news anchor, investigative journalist, and host of the program Boom Bust, airing weekdays on RT America. We'll be back. This is Fault Lines.
Fault Lines.
Tune in every Monday to Loud and Clear with Brian Becker for our regular segment, Education for Liberation with Bill Ayers, where we take a look at the state of education across the country. What's happening in our schools, colleges, and universities, and what impact does it have on the world around us? Our resident expert is Bill Ayers, the legendary activist, educator, and author. Tune in to Loud and Clear this Monday and every Monday for Education for Liberation with Bill Ayers.
Are you bored? Are you lonely? Do you need a hug? Well, we can't give you that, but we can keep you up to date on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines. We are joined by award-winning television news anchor, investigative journalist, and host of the program Boom Bust, Ben Swann. You continue to join us. Thank you for joining us, Ben. So
glad to be on, guys. Thank you.
Excellent. So we were going into this idea of basically, I'd make the argument that we've lost our commons, and I think this is a terrifying reality. You have capitalist corporate giants that are being influenced by government, but also they have their own capitalistic incentive in regards to having some speech that may be more beneficial than others. From the standpoint of John Q. Public, who actually wants to have that speech, and he doesn't necessarily want to be outside screaming on a soapbox in DC, what has been done from the standpoint of trying to take either legal action with this notion of making this nationalizing, coming up with let's say a united version of these companies that allow people to do this from a public standpoint, or for that matter, laws that would allow free speech on these platforms?
Right. So there's been a lot of debate about exactly what this looks like and whether or not free speech rights even exist on these platforms, because they are private platforms. In order for there to be free speech rights, they would have to be considered public squares. And one of the realities, I think, of where we are right now is that we don't believe really more in this concept of free speech. So if I were to say free speech, and then as soon as I say that, there's a certain number of your listeners who are going to say, well, that can't include ... Right. And so they all go back to this default of, well, it can't include hate speech. It can't include, threats. It can't include all these kinds of things. And so we have to really define what is free speech. And when we talk about free speech, how vital is it to our society? Because right now we don't have a push for free speech either on the right or the left. We have a fight for conformed speech that we all agree upon that is acceptable, and then let's debate within that space. And so that's one of the difficulties, because my personal belief is that the more you clamp down on speech, the more you create it in dark places, the more that people who really do kind of thrive in these hate worlds, they seem to actually grow in those times, because as soon as you tell people you can't, they start becoming intrigued by what can't I do and why can't I do it.
That's right. There's almost this economic supply and demand for information. Is that kind of your take?
Well, there is, but there's also this movement of, listen, the more that we allow people to speak and the more debate and discussion we have in time, I think the closer people get together, the more that people realize they have more in common than they have that differentiates them. I really believe that. And I believe that the more people talk to each other,
the better they do in terms of actually coming to consensus on ideas. What we have right now, though, is we don't have a marketplace of ideas or a marketplace of debate. Instead, we have very narrow views of what is right and wrong and what steps should be taken in society. A great example is everything that's going on right now, with the conversations over race in this country right now. And let's be honest, no matter which side you fall on that, right now there's very limited discussion happening. There's a lot of shouting. There's a lot of people yelling over each other, but there are very few people who are actually talking to each other and trying to get a better understanding. There are some, but there are very few who are. And in the tech space,
I don't know if I agree with that, Ben. I slightly disagree with that. Let me explain why. When I look for the first time in my lifetime, anyway, and even if you look back at the civil rights movement, whites did not agree that race was an issue. I mean, I watched the polling on this, and it changed. It shifted by like 20, 30 points, where the majority of the population, white, black, and everything in between, said, yes, race is an issue. Now, I get that there are a lot of people in the street shouting and everything else, but there are people listening. I don't think those polls would have shifted if they weren't.
Let me ask you this, but where are the really meaningful discussions taking place about where do we go from here?
Oh, I agree with you. Yeah, no, that's fair. I agree with you on that part. But is that really ever part of it? Like, fair enough. Martin Luther King, fair enough. But he was like an anomaly. In real terms, in these movements, ultimately, this is what we want. But that want is always, hazy. Like, think of the Yellow Vest movement. You had all of these people say, we want, gas tax. And then after a while, I was like, we want Macron to leave. But there were like 30 different requests that those people want, that this broad distaste with the way the system is. I think that's what you're saying. It's just this kind of movement where these people are saying, look, I hate the idea of defunding police. I don't like the saying. I think the saying is just plays into politics per se. But I do think that this large amount of people who came out into the streets, in and of itself, exponentially, makes a point that the larger population got. Even if they don't have a substantive thing of this is what we want in real political terms, I do think that the fact that the larger population agrees with the very act of the protests and that the point of view of the population has shifted, that some conversation, regardless of how minimal, has taken place, and it has been able to influence and shape the public opinion and get that public opinion to shift. Do you agree with that? I mean, I could be wrong. I mean, if I'm wrong, have at me.
I agree with that 100%. That the protests have drawn attention to very real problems, because there are very real problems with policing. There are very real problems with those institutions and how they've been set up in this country. One issue that's rarely talked about, I talk about it quite a bit, but it's rarely talked about, is the issue of how municipalities use police officers to basically extract revenue from people in their cities on a regular basis. That was one of the biggest problems that came out of Ferguson that was never really heavily reported. Remember when the DOJ went to Ferguson and they did this investigation, the number one problem they found was that one of the poorest communities on all of Missouri had the highest rate of taxation through revenue generation, meaning fines and fees and tickets being given to that population there. And so when you extract so much from people, you create this incredible burden that's on them. But that's really not being discussed. And so my point being this, there's a moment right now, where the attention has been brought. There's a lot of focus on, okay, we accept that there's problems. People know it in their gut. They recognize it through the protests. But now comes the point where we have to say, so what can we do to make actual change? And my belief is establishment forces on both the right and the left in this country don't want actual change. That the establishment likes the system as it is because it works for them. So they love the idea of chaos because they thrive in chaos. But when you say, so what can we really do? They don't want to actually do. Those on the left want to keep a problem, because as long as there's a problem, they can always point to it and say, we're the ones who are going to fix it. And those on the right will say, there's not really a problem here. And so, or vice versa, because they both play this game. And what we end up with was, we'll walk away from this moment. My fear is we'll walk away from this moment and we won't change anything. We'll have just felt a lot. We do a lot of fear culture, but but we don't do a lot to actually change the problems in the culture.
I hear you. So I'm going to jump in here for a second. I want to ask the question, the same question that I think we think the protesters should be asking themselves. What should we do about this? And I don't mean about the object level problem. I mean about the problem you were just talking about. If there's this intense political divide that's exacerbated by the media, it doesn't see any signs of breaking down, is only increasing. Like we're talking about that's a very clear problem. That's, I think we all agree on this. What do we do about that? How do we deal with that problem?
Well, I think the biggest way that you deal with that problem is that you recognize that there are, and I truly believe this, tens of millions of people in this country who want to actually see problems resolved. Yes. They want to see issues, and I don't just mean these big problems. They also want a lot of smaller things fixed as well, right? They just want to be in a society where they can take care of their families and be in good communities, and they're not going through chaotic problems on a regular basis. They want people to be good to each other. And so one of the things that we have to do as media is recognize that there's a lot of people who are tired of the back and forth, everyone pointing at everyone else all the time, and everyone who's in power saying, if only I had a little more power, I could fix your problems. So just give me some more and get these people out of the way. And it's the back and forth and the mudslinging, and it's a disgusting place. It's the reason that Congress is so disliked in this country. It's the reason that half the American population is no longer registered Republican or Democrat. Because even though they'll come out and vote in a general election, for the most part, they're saying, I'm tired of the system that we have. It's a broken system. So the way that you get around that is through more voices in media and more communication between people that allows people to actually talk about these things and see what's really happening in terms of how we're being divided and pushed against each other, and what can we do to find commonality? Where can we find common focus and common goals? And I think, again, I'll say it again, I think that in this country, the majority of the people in this country have much more in common than they do that separates them. But media will never tell you that. They'll tell you that we hate each other, that we despise each other, that we're hiding in these places of hatred for each other, that we want to see each other fail. And I don't think that's actually true, but media keeps telling us that. And so we have one of two choices. We either continue to consume the lie that's being told to us, or we just tune out of it completely. And unfortunately, when there's a big moment, like you'll see these protests, people will now tune back in, and they're seeing all these messages. And I've got to tell you, I'd like to hear from you guys, but when I see coverage of what's happening, I look at it saying, I don't think this accurately represents the community that I'm in. Here in Atlanta, we had, protests, and then we had the Rashard Brooks, who was shot outside of the Wendy's by police officers there, and lots of debate about it. And online, people are fighting about it in very vitriolic ways. But here in Atlanta, where I am, people do not feel that way. Black, Hispanic, it doesn't matter. People look at it and say, we don't want to divide our community. We don't want to abolish our police departments, and we don't want to keep killing people who were stopped by police. We don't want any of those things. So how do we find some solutions to move forward as a community together? I think that's what people want. They don't want to destroy each other. But media tells us that everyone wants to destroy each other.
Yeah, Ben, I agree with you. I mean, media has a capitalistic incentive in that, right? I mean, basically, if it bleeds, it leads. And so, we want to... Like even presidential elections, it's taken almost like a wrestling match. It's like, oh, this guy in this corner, this guy in this corner, and so slams somebody else. It's done in these kind of hyperbolic ways. I also agree with you with the people thing. I think ultimately you're right that people basically want to get together, and ultimately they don't necessarily want to get rid of their police force, which defunding the police sounds like in some way. I think ultimately they just want communities where they'll be safe in and so forth, and how you make that work.
2 minutes.
And the conversation that gets had is taken over often by Democrats and Republicans. Democrats in the sense of trying to co-opt it, Republicans trying to co-opt it, where really neither one of those solutions are solutions. There's nobody to vote for. Shane?
I agree. I mean, again, this seems... These are longstanding problems. On the one hand, let's go back to the sort of philosophical foundations. With America, you have a country that's founded on these principles of like liberal equality, and it gets betrayed very quickly. But I think what you've got to look at there is this idea that we can communicate, we can talk, It's not just party, it's not just hierarchy, it's not just aristocracy. The way that we're going to solve our problems is by communicating and improving our thoughts and kind of being kind to each other. And the problem is, over the course of a couple of centuries, and specifically over the course of this one, that process, and I think the assumptions that we bring to that process have decayed. And again, modern democracy, the way that we're implementing it in this country, seems to just want to pit us against each other. And I think we really need to reconsider and revitalize our take on these things. We only have a minute left, Ben, but what's your response to that real quick before we go?
Well, I think that's absolutely right, and I think that the other important point is, the idea that a lot of this comes out of a capitalistic view. I wish that were true, because I think that's easier to resolve, and unfortunately, I think that this comes from a more organized view that says because and whether we can argue whether that's capitalism or not, but at the end of the day, few people and a few companies that really control a lot of what we're seeing because they're profiting from it. There is a profit mechanism built into keeping people divided, in keeping a few tech companies controlling everything, in keeping a few marketplaces on.
Ben, you're going into some great stuff there. We're going to have to get you back on soon. Ben Swan, great guest. Back with you tomorrow. Thank you so much for joining us, Ben. This is Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Guys, as always, I appreciate it. I know it's early morning. Some people might be like, what the hell is Jamal doing on Fault Lines? Jamal is doing on Fault Lines because the team is unfortunately no more. But hopefully, ideally, we can keep this ship running. Thank you all for joining me. Honestly, I appreciate it. This was a great show. Ben Swan, all of these guys are awesome. I watch Ben Swan on, I always see him on, not Boom and Bust, on Manila Chan Show. Not to mention Rick Sanchez was really good too. But I will end this here. You guys will see me a little bit later today. Like, share, subscribe. Fault Lines 7 to 10. Thanks everyone. I'll see you in a few.